I don't play with goats. On March 14, 2011, all leading Russian internet media and information agencies reported on a working meeting in the Kremlin between the President of the Russian Federation Dmitry Medvedev and the Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation Yuri Chaika on the issue of toughening criminal liability for engaging in illegal gambling business. The discussion at the meeting, of course, was about hundreds of underground casinos across the country where this activity is illegally carried out. Those who do this, frankly, are insane. They do not put the law in anything, the president said at the meeting. Perhaps the most remarkable moment in this meeting was how Dmitry Medvedev showed Yuri Chaika on his tablet PC the main page of the website, Where is the Casino? Only a couple of seconds federal TV channels showed this footage on the air, but even this moment was enough for all the leading media and news agencies that covered the meeting of the president with the prosecutor general to give a link to the internet resource that interested Dmitry Medvedev. After that, the address on the web, gdecasino.ru, turned out to be inaccessible to users. Apparently, this site simply collapsed due to the flurry of visits that followed, which could amount to tens, if not hundreds of thousands. For us, conspiracy theorists, this fact did not come as a complete surprise. And that's why. Since January 2011, we have been following the development of this topic quite carefully, collecting a corresponding dossier on the issue of interest to us. Therefore, we have every reason to offer our own version to the thoughtful and interested reader, explaining the reason for such a rapid ascent to the peak of the popularity of this internet resource. So, back in early to mid-December 2010, an influential Saratov politician and entrepreneur, the main sponsor of the United Russia election campaign in the Saratov region in 2007, Sergei Kurikhin received insider information from the Kremlin about an upcoming large-scale operation to neutralize high-ranking Siloviki, who were protecting the underground gambling business. It is possible that this insider was leaked to him by a senior party comrade, Vyacheslav Volodin, head of the apparatus of the government of the Russian Federation in the rank of Deputy Prime Minister, with whom Sergei Kurikhin has close relations. Being a man of outstanding creative abilities, Sergei Georgievich, presumably, immediately realized what political benefits could be drawn from this situation. It should be noted that at that time, law enforcement agencies, according to informed sources, had an increased interest in his person in connection with the high-profile Mikhail Lysenko case, linking the business interests of the arrested head of the Angelsky Municipal District with the business of Sergei Kurikhin. This circumstance, apparently, was the reason for the cooling of relations with Kurikhin on the part of the head of the Central Internal Affairs Directorate for the Saratov region, Sergei Arnin, and the prosecutor of the Saratov region, Vladimir Stepanov. Against the background of this confrontation, only patronage from the acting Nikolai Nikitin, head of the investigative committee for the Saratov region of the RF Investigative Committee, was clearly not enough. Non-standard solutions were required from Kurikhin himself. And such a solution was found. Most likely, it was Sergei Kurikhin who initiated the creation of a new internet resource, having financed the work on its production and maintenance. Prior to this, the local oligarch had repeatedly managed to distinguish himself as the commander of the Internet Front. For example, on his initiative, in the fall of 2010, the Association of Bloggers of the Saratov region was created, which played a role in the information war unleashed by Kurikhin against the head of the city of Saratov, Oleg Grishchenko, ended. Not without the participation of Vyacheslav Volodin, with the reconciliation of the parties and the receipt by Sergei Georgievich of certain preferences. Which, by the way, helped Oleg Grishchenko not to screw up at the municipal elections held in Saratov in March 2011, and to extend his powers as the head of the city for a new term. So, on December 25, 2010, a second-level domain name gdecasino.ru was registered by a person who wished to remain anonymous. The creators called the site, Where is the Casino, and the phrase, Find and Neutralize, was chosen as the media slogan. After the publication in Komsomolskaya Pravda, a student looks for underground casinos in Saratov and puts their addresses on the site, KP, dated January 24, 2011, Saratov 21-year-old programmer Anton Heistver began to appear as the only moderator of this internet resource, the son of Alexei Heistver, who worked in the mid-1990s as a photographer and IT specialist in the media group of Vyacheslav Volodin, and then moved to Moscow. No other details and indications of the creators of this internet resource were presented. In short, this site is a set of Google Maps of the cities of the Russian Federation, available online. That is, the users of the resource themselves can point to them the locations of the underground casinos or gambling halls they have discovered, illustrating the index icons with sent photographs of these points and accompanying them with explanatory text. In addition, the news feed of this site periodically publishes information about raids by law enforcement agencies that reveal such kind of hotspots. Moreover, in the first weeks, only the Saratov media and internet resources got into the news feed. It should be noted that the presentation of this site to the general public was preceded by the corresponding media artillery preparation, ordered by Sergei Kurikhin to his, and not only, editorial offices. Starting from January 17, 2011, on internet resources and in the media controlled by Sergei Georgievich, the internet newspaper, The Fourth Power, the news agency, Vzglyad.info, the online television company, TV Saratov, the newspapers, Saratovsky Vzglyad, and Resonance, as well as on the website of the Rossiya Saratov news agency, which is funded by the influential politician and businessman Leonid Fetlicher, an old friend of Sergei Kurikhin and a long-term political opponent of Vyacheslav Volodin. Reports of law enforcement raids began to appear with enviable regularity in order to suppress the activities underground casinos and gambling halls. In their intensity, these short messages more and more resembled reports from the fronts of an undeclared war. The main emphasis in these numerous publications was placed on the fact that without protection, these hot places simply could not function even for several days. January 28, 2011, on one of the federal TV channels there is a news story about this internet project, which causes a lively response from internet users from St. Petersburg. Peter is with you. In autumn, several cafes and shops, about a dozen, were closed near the house and gambling halls were opened instead. There are only 5 in one block. The people are indignant, but what will you do with them? Writes one of the commentators. February 4, 2011, Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the official press organ of the government of the Russian Federation, under the heading Initiative, publishes the material of the Saratov journalist Andrei Kulikov, Tip for a Policeman. The internet community has begun to fight underground casinos. On the same day, the article also appears on the RG website, where tens of thousands of visitors get acquainted with it. A website has appeared on the internet that exposes underground gambling establishments. The goal of the project, according to the creators of the site, is to identify casinos that masquerade as online clubs or electronic goods stores, and to achieve their closure, the author reports. The site was created in Saratov, but recently the geography has expanded significantly. Now there are links to gambling establishments in Moscow, Voronezh, Samara, St. Petersburg, Tver, and a number of other cities, Kulikov points out. At first, the police and prosecutors' authorities were skeptical about the next internet initiative of the lower classes. They say, such an internet resource can serve as a help for citizens suffering from an obsessive addiction to gambling. But then, when the zone of combat operations spread from the Volga banks to the Moscow region, this bossy skepticism was removed as if by magic. On February 5, 2011, a message appeared on the news feed of the Vzglyad.info news agency about the operation of an illegal casino in the very center of Saratov. The author of the message unequivocally alludes to the involvement of the subordinates of Lieutenant General of Militia Sergei Arnin in the protection of this illegal establishment. Apparently, the owners of the underground casino firmly hold the control levers in their hands. How else to explain the fact that the promises of the head of the Central Internal Affairs Directorate of the region, Sergei Arnin, to close the casino, remained unheeded? Perhaps the general subordinates have already figured out the topic in their own way and to their advantage. 04 Prosecutors. On February 11, 2011, the country was shocked by the first reports of the existence of a whole network of underground casinos in the Moscow region, which is protected by the Moscow Region Prosecutor's Office. On this day, a high-profile criminal case is initiated against the shadow businessman Ivan Nazarov, who is suspected of giving bribes to prosecutors who turned a blind eye to this crime. This was announced by Igor Volkov, who issued a surrender and worked with Nazarov. On this day, an open confrontation begins between the leaders of the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation, who received an independent status thanks to the president, and the generals of the FSB of Russia loyal to Dmitry Medvedev with the corrupt top of the Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation, which is considered more loyal to Vladimir Putin. On February 12, 2011, FSB officers searched the building of the Triumph Gallery, located in the center of Moscow, on Novokuznetskaya Street, with a view to the involvement of this room in the concealment of material evidence in this criminal case. According to the Chekists, Ivan Nazarov's office was located there. During the search, documents related to the former activities of the fugitive oligarch Boris Berezovsky were seized. Some observers do not rule out that, under this plausible pretext, documents were confiscated revealing a possible connection between Boris Berezovsky and Vladimir Putin in the past, which will be of exceptional value on the eve of the presidential elections in Russia, or vice versa. The actions of the office's employees were aimed specifically at excluding the likelihood of these compromising documents being discovered. Recall that earlier this building housed the Logovaz reception house, which was headed by Boris Berezovsky. On February 14, 2011, the press center of the FSB of the Russian Federation stated that the illegal business of Ivan Nazarov was patronized by the prosecutor's office and the police near Moscow, including the first deputy regional prosecutor Alexander Ignatenko. As noted in the FSB report, gambling halls, which were allegedly organized by 31-year-old Ivan Nazarov, worked in 15 cities of the Moscow region. About 1,200 slot machines were seized there, as well as documentation and seals incriminating criminal fishing. The gambling business was disguised as so-called incentive lotteries. According to operatives, the gambling network's criminal income was between $5 million and $10 million a month, and the network had been operating for more than 3 years. A criminal case was initiated under Part 4 of Article 159 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, fraud on an especially large scale. On February 16, 2011, a high-ranking representative of the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation stated that documents had been found that testify to the connection of Ivan Nazarov with the prosecutor of the Moscow region Alexander Mokhov. Later, the regional prosecutor denied the accusations and, together with his first deputy, applied for state protection. It was also announced about the detention of 3 policemen from the Moscow region who received at least 3 million rubles for protection of illegal gambling establishments, and about the searches that the FSB officers conducted in the main building of the Central Internal Affairs Directorate for the Moscow region in Nikitsky Lane and in the building of the Department of Economic Crimes of the Regional Directorate of Internal Affairs on Vitebskaya Street. In total, according to the FSB, at least 35 searches were carried out in the offices and apartments of the defendants in this criminal case. In the intervals between these high-profile statements, the Moscow region police and the prosecutor's office somehow unconvincingly bounced back. One got the impression that on even numbers they attacked the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation and the FSB, and on odd numbers the prosecutor's office and the Central Internal Affairs Directorate counterattacked. On the same day, February 16, 2011, in the morning, on the news feed of the Vzglyadinfo news agency, a stunning message appears under the heading, FSB, the prosecutor's office patronizes illegal gambling business, which sounds like a statement. Sergei Kurikhin, after waiting for the right moment, strikes. Guided by the principle of divide and rule, he no longer subjected Sergei Aronin's department to smashing criticism and was already targeting the regional prosecutor's office. In the Saratov region, the regional police department is trying to fight a network of illegal gambling establishments. However, the efforts of law enforcement officers and the press often encounter direct or indirect opposition from prosecutors. According to police officers, in Saratov, the vitality of the gambling business is due to the fact that the owners of the underground industry have patrons in the prosecutor's office, summarizes the unknown author of the message. It is quite clear that in this case we are not talking about employees of the prosecutor's office near Moscow, but about subordinates of the Saratov regional prosecutor Vladimir Stepanov. On February 17, 2011, Alexander Ignatenko was removed from his post for the duration of an internal audit, and by decision of the Pushkin City Court, Ivan Nazarov himself and the cops who protected him were taken into custody for 2 months. Deputy head of the Department of Economic Crimes of the Internal Affairs Directorate for the Pushkinsky district of the Moscow region, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Pishkin, as well as detectives from the Regional Department of Economic Crime for Internal Affairs, Major Dmitry Akulin and Captain Sergei Ermakov. In total, the gambling king Nazarov was arrested several times. No sooner had he been released from the courtroom at the protest of the Humane Prosecutor's office near Moscow than he was immediately, on the threshold of the House of Justice, knitted by operatives of the Investigative Committee or the FSB. The fact is that in relation to Mr. Nazarov, they acted very prudently. Each district investigative department of the Investigative Committee, in whose controlled territory underground casinos were discovered, opened a separate criminal case against him. And as soon as Nazarov got away, in one case, he was immediately fined in another. We also note that in addition to the obeyed administrator of one of the salons, Igor Volkov, and Ivan Nazarov himself, his assistant Elena Guseva and business partner Marat Mamiv were arrested by a court decision. On the same day, February 17, 2011, in a number of media reports, Deputy Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation Vladimir Malinovsky began to appear in a negative light, who, as it turned out, had earlier insisted on the termination of the criminal case against Ivan Nazarov and his accomplices, as a result of which the suspects were released and then detained again, but already, formally, in a different criminal case, as mentioned above. At the same time, information appeared in the press that the regional prosecutor Mokhov near Moscow and his first deputy Ignatenko, as well as the prosecutor of the city of Odintsovo Roman Nishchemenko, at the expense of funds paid by firms controlled by Nazarov, went on vacation abroad. The members of their families also rested. The evidence in the case was documents seized during a search in travel agencies where these vouchers were issued. Also on February 17, 2011, on its website, the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation announced the initiation of a criminal case on the illegal allocation of land to high-ranking employees of the Prosecutor's Office of the Moscow region and the Central Internal Affairs Directorate for the Moscow region. Yuri Korolov, first deputy head of the administration of the Krasnogorsk Municipal District, became the defendant in this criminal case. Members of this partnership are people who hold high positions in the regional prosecutor's office and the regional police department and do not have the right to receive these sites. The deputy prosecutor Alexander Ignatenko was the chairman of this dacha partnership. The corruption scandal began to gain serious momentum. On February 18, 2011, one of the deputy prosecutors of the Moscow region cancels the decision to initiate a dacha case, which causes a storm of indignation in public opinion. The names of other defendants in this case emerge in the media. Among the summer residents are detectives of the regional GUVD Alexei Gubanov and Vyacheslav Ivanov, deputy head of the Regional Economic Crime Department of the Krasnogorsk Internal Affairs Directorate Yevgeny Volchakov, the prosecutor of Krasnogorsk Yevgeny Puzanov, the prosecutor of Istra Mikhail Popkov and the prosecutor of Pushkino Ruslan Rezimenko. It turned out that the market value of the allocated land in the Novorizhskoye highway area is 206 million rubles, but the rent for the plots was set at the rate of 2,000 to 6,000 rubles per year for 200 acres. On February 19 and 20, 2011, the leading federal television channels, NTV, REN-TV, etc., in the evening showed popular information and analytical programs containing stories about corrupt employees of the regional prosecutor's office and the regional police department, involved both in the case of underground casinos and in the new cottage business. These telecasts, as one would expect, caused a huge public outcry. On February 21, 2011, the famous coordination meeting chaired by the President of the Russian Federation Dmitry Medvedev followed, at which he pointed out the inadmissibility of using the media and public opinion to put pressure on the court and investigating authorities. Many observers then perceived this passage as an act of capitulation to Putin's bloc of Siloviki in the person of Yuri Chaika and Rashid Nurgalayev. The most pessimistic expectations began to hover in the air, and the opposition declared the president's impotence in the face of corruption in the highest echelons of power. In the next 3 weeks, all the attention of the media and the public following the political news was completely absorbed by the upcoming local and regional elections, until on March 14, 2011 thunderstruck. Perhaps, for the first time in the history of his presidency, Dmitry Medvedev gave an order to such a high official as the Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation, demonstrating in front of television cameras the source of the information that prompted him to do so. And such a source was not a report prepared by the accounts chamber or an analytical note compiled by the Secret Service, but a simple provincial website containing information that was deadly for the Siloviki. And Sergei Kurikhin can now rightfully be considered the most influential, after Vyacheslav Volodin, politician in the Saratov region. However, given the federal status of Vyacheslav Viktorovich, in fact, we can already talk about the unconditional superiority of Sergei Georgievich in this region. In the 20th of March 2011, many observers following the development of this confrontation might have thought that the situation was again developing in favor of the prosecutors. On March 21, the prosecutor of the Moscow region Alexander Mokhov again appeared at work, although the pre-investigation check against him had not yet been terminated. And on March 23 and 31, the prosecutor's office subsequently dropped 2 criminal cases against Ivan Nazarov in custody. In addition, on March 24, 2011, it became known that the Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation, which completed an audit with respect to prosecutors near Moscow, did not reveal anything corrupt in their relations with Ivan Nazarov. The publication of the results of this check caused an immediate reaction from the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation, where they refuted the conclusions of the Prosecutor General's office and initiated a new criminal case against Ivan Nazarov. On March 29, 2011, the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation initiated criminal cases against the prosecutor of the city of Noginsk Vladimir Glebov and the prosecutor of the city of Klin Eduard Kaplan, but the very next day, Deputy Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation Viktor Grin closed these cases. At the same time, information was leaked to the media that the Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation Yuri Chaika wanted to receive from his subordinates, the prosecutor of the Moscow region Alexander Mokhov, his first deputy Alexander Ignatenko and the head of the 5th Department of the Moscow Regional Prosecutor's Office Dmitry Yurimov, resignations of his own free will. But nothing happened. Waited. Meanwhile, the Kremlin expected much more decisive action from Chaika. And then, heavy artillery entered the battle. At stake is the presidency. During the trial regarding the closure of another criminal case against Nazarov, the prosecution read out the testimony of a witness under the fictitious name Nikolaev, who explained to the court that a group of people acted as interested intermediaries in establishing corruption ties between the gambling king and the prosecutors who protected him, led by Artyom Chaika, the son of the Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation Yuri Chaika. The news was immediately replicated by all the leading media and caused a strong reaction from public opinion. The Prosecutor General's office itself commented on these testimonies as nonsense of anonymous applicants. According to Life News, this mysterious witness could be none other than the former deputy prosecutor of the Moscow region Stanislav Byansky, who, having entered the territory of the residence of the President of the Russian Federation, allegedly tried to give Dmitry Medvedev a folder with compromising information on his former colleagues, but was detained by the FSO. However, Byansky himself, in an interview with a journalist from the Kommersant newspaper, categorically denied this information, which did not particularly surprise anyone. Later, he will generally state that publications in the media about his alleged penetration into the Medvedev residence were ordered and paid for by the prosecutor's mafia, in order to discredit him, Byansky, in the eyes of his colleagues. Although how a civil feat, even if fictional, can discredit a person, is absolutely not clear. On March 30, 2011, it became known that the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation plans to summon Artyom Chaika for interrogation. In addition, the name of the son of the Prosecutor General also surfaced in connection with the case of extortion from the head of the Serpukhov Municipal District of the Moscow region Alexander Shistun in the amount of $2 million for stopping the check of the official by the Moscow Regional Prosecutor's Office. In response, the Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation demanded that the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation conduct an audit against the head of the investigative department for the Moscow region, Andrei Markov. They say, the chief investigator of the Moscow region could be involved in extorting money from the head of the Serpukhov district, Alexander Shistun, from whom the head of the Department for Supervision of Sergei Abrasimov was investigated by the main Directorate of the Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation for the Southern Federal District, for which he was ultimately sentenced to 8 years. Commenting on this requirement, the official representative of the Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation, Marina Gridneva, literally stated the following: looking for traitors in other people's ranks, the investigative committee for some reason point-blank does not want to see its own, Lenta. Ru, dated March 31, 2011. In the eyes of public opinion, a very unattractive picture of state decay began to take shape. The Russians began to conclude that in addition to the FSB and the police, which were being urgently reformed into the police, all other law enforcement agencies were completely rotten, including the Prosecutor General's Office and the Investigative Committee. If Putin, building his vertical of power, relied on such Siloviki, then what is the national leader himself? And if Medvedev, flirting with such Siloviki, makes ceremonies, instead of bringing order to the country with an iron fist, then why do we need such a president? In other words, from the escalation of the public conflict within the power bloc, both tandemocrats, both Putin and Medvedev, began to bear the rating costs, which was revealed by the ongoing opinion polls, the data of which remained closed to outsiders. At the same time, it was noticeable that Putin defiantly distanced himself from this conflict, giving the opportunity to disentangle the mess to those who brewed it. On April 11, 2011, the war of the security forces reached a new qualitative level. This time, the escalation of the conflict directly affected the judicial community. Namely, the investigators of the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation attempted to conduct a search in the cottage where Vasily Gavrichkov, deputy chairman of the Moscow Regional Court, lives, but, apparently, they were stopped by a call from above. Moreover, the Bastrikinites, knowing full well about the special legal status of a judge, inviolability of the home, deliberately went to aggravate the conflict. In addition, as many analysts believe, the Moscow Regional Court is a secret closet, but not of Pope Carlo, but of much more serious figures, the governor of the Moscow region Boris Gromov, who owes his political career to Vyacheslav Volodin, who ensured his election to the State Duma from Saratov in mid-1990s. It's scary to even imagine what could happen if, one by one, judges near Moscow begin to inject. Then the case of underground casinos will generally seem like baby talk. Throughout the conflict, many analysts have repeatedly asked the question, what, in fact, is the meaning of this war of the security forces? What exactly are her reasons? Of course, it is more likely to believe in the banal version about the redistribution of the gambling market, which has gone into the shadow, but even people who are far from conspiracy theories are well aware that this was not without political rivalry. But who exactly competes and with whom, if the victory comes at such a price? Browser tapes. Ru, Tatyana Efremenko cites, for example, the following opinion. Some analysts point out that the rivalry between departments is largely a reflection of the rivalry between two people, Alexander Bastrikin and Viktor Grin. In 2006, both of them were appointed Deputy Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation and, according to a number of sources, immediately entered into a confrontation. In 2011, Bastrikin, who heads the investigative committee, ceased to be Deputy Prosecutor General, and Grin remained in his former position. Everything, of course, is like this. Bastrikin and Grin, probably, really cannot stand each other, which is confirmed by the whole course of events of the war of the security forces. With such fanaticism, only sworn enemies are capable of putting sticks in each other's wheels. But do you believe that the personal enmity of far from the first persons of the state could cause a months-long war, in which almost the entire law enforcement system of Russia was drawn into, and the political establishment of Moscow was literally put on the ears? Exactly. In our opinion, the rivalry between Bastrikin and Grin is rather a reflection of the rivalry between the two departments, but not vice versa. At least for today. In addition, the appointment of people who cannot stand each other to the positions of deputies has been a common practice since Soviet times, especially in law enforcement agencies. In such a personnel situation, any boss, seeing the rivalry of his deputies, scribbling memos on each other, felt more confident, without fear that one of them, gaining excess weight, would sit him down. In addition, many analysts were confused by the fact that Alexander Bastrakin was originally a protege of Vladimir Putin, with whom he not only studied in the same group at the law faculty of Leningrad State University, but was even the head of the students of this group. Such biographical closeness to Vladimir Vladimirovich explains a lot. Much, but not all. Remember for yourself, how warm are your relations now with your former classmates, and even with your classmates. At the very least, maintain some form of friendly courtesy when you meet with them once every 10 years about the next graduation anniversary. So it is with Putin. But when there is a shortage of their own people, who urgently need to be put in key positions in the state, then all the friends you are more or less familiar with take on the outlines of a kind of personnel reserve in Russia. This explains the unexpectedly rapid growth of the St. Petersburg professor of transport law, Alexander Bastrakin. We are almost certain that in fact, in this war of the security forces, Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation Yuri Chaika represents the interests of the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation Vladimir Putin, who is striving to receive presidential powers in March 2012. But the chairman of the investigative committee of the Russian Federation Alexander Bastrakin, on the contrary, expresses the interests of the president of the Russian Federation Dmitry Medvedev, who is striving to preserve his presidential powers. This is evidenced by the entire course of the confrontation not only between the two law enforcement agencies, but also the 10 Democrats themselves, Putin and Medvedev. It was President Dmitry Medvedev who, in January 2011, signed the decree on the establishment of the Investigative Committee of Russia as an independent power structure that got rid of its link to the Prosecutor General's office of the Russian Federation, and approved Alexander Bastrakin as chairman of the RFIC. Earlier, in 2010, Dmitry Medvedev initiated the reform of the police into the police, shaking up the entire structure of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation. The president dismissed dozens of generals of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, who formed the backbone of Putin's support in this department. Many of them went to jail as corrupt officials. Now, taking advantage of the opportunity, Medvedev is exercising his carte blanche to subordinate such a key agency as the General Prosecutor's Office of the Russian Federation to his political interests, and the fate of Yuri Chaika is practically a foregone conclusion. Let's add here the serious reform of the judicial system started by Medvedev. Next in line is the army, as the most important power resource of the presidential power. The explosions at military arsenals in the Ulyanovsk region, in November 2010, Bashkiria, in May 2011, and Udmurtia, in June 2011, as well as the unsuccessful launches of strategic missiles that preceded this and the actual disruption of the defense order by the departments of the Ministry of Defense and the military-industrial complex. True a sign that after a series of resignations of high-ranking generals, the extremely unpopular Defense Minister Anatoly Serdyukov, who received his post, thanks to Putin, will also lose his seat. There is not so much a war of the security forces as a war for the Siloviki waged by the 10 Democrats, and this, in turn, indicates that Dmitry Medvedev does not intend to cede his presidential post under any circumstances. The Attorney General is out. On March 25, 2011, in broad daylight, almost in the center of Moscow, a black sports car, Audi TT, with transit numbers drove at full speed into the oncoming lane and rammed the motorcade of the Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation Yuri Chaika, after which an unknown kamikaze, leaving a foreign car at the scene of an accident, escaped safely. This story immediately became public. At that time, many observers regarded this strange traffic accident as a kind of black mark addressed to the Prosecutor General. In addition, against the backdrop of the scandal associated with underground casinos in the Moscow region and the participation of prosecutors in their protection, the media have already come to the attention of the forgotten episodes of the hectic life of the 35-year-old son of the Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation. The public was reminded that in 1999, Artyom Chaika already had to testify to the investigation, when the police detained bandits who were driving around in a foreign car that belonged to him with a special ticket issued in the name of his father. Then the criminals were convicted for extortion, but the law enforcement agencies did not have any complaints against Chaika Jr., as well as Chaika Sr. In addition, the public was shocked by the details of how Artyom Chaika came to control Oao-Tyretsky salt mine, the fourth largest enterprise of its kind in all of Russia. Previously, this salt mine was 100% state-owned, but at the end of 2010 it was sold for 600 million rubles to a certain Solidarity LLC, which is allegedly affiliated with the business structures of Artyom Chaika. At the same time, the leading companies in this market were not admitted to the auction for the purchase of this salt deposit, for unknown reasons. Moreover, Alexander Shistun, who testified, claimed that Ivan Nazarov, who extorted money from him, demanded, among other things, that employees of Oao-Tyretsky salt mine be placed in the management of the SE Serpukhov subsoil, which indicates the growing appetites of Chaika Jr. Agree that against the background of such high-profile statements made to the family, it was not easy for Chaika Sr. to hold the defense further. And then there was information that the Parliamentary Security Committee intends to invite representatives of the warring parties, investigators and prosecutors, to a closed meeting to find out which of them receives income from underground casinos. This meeting was scheduled for April 7, 2011. And Yuri Chaika, apparently, decided to give up. More precisely, to hand over their own. Ahead of the Duma execution, President Dmitry Medvedev himself conducts a face-to-face confrontation in his office with both heads of the power departments, the Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation Yuri Chaika and the Chairman of the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation Alexander Bastrikin. This meeting raised more questions than answers. The Kremlin did not provide any details of the conversation. Of the entire description of the event, there is only a protocol photo, where the heads of the warring departments sit face to face in front of the eyes of the president. The president himself in the protocol photo is unkind and looks menacingly towards the prosecutor general. According to some reports, the meeting was not in the president's plan. And they didn't even come up with a proper cover for it, the columnist for Polit.ru, Mikhail Zakharov. The failure to reconcile the security forces will mean that the president is not quite ready to independently resolve serious issues without the participation of a senior tandemocrat, the journalist concludes. Nevertheless, in fact, the supporters of President Medvedev did not even think about any reconciliation of the security forces, which clearly confirms the further course of events. In order to somehow sweeten the pill for the Prosecutor General, on April 4, 2011, the leadership of the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation issued a warning to its official representative, Irina Gumanea, who leaked information to the media about the upcoming interrogation of Artyom Chaika as part of investigative actions in 2 criminal cases at once, about protection of underground casinos and extortion of money from the head of the Serpukhov region. It is significant that Vyacheslav Ushakov, the head of the Center for Public Relations of the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, was fired for a similar office misconduct committed in February 2011. But then this decision could be pushed through by Vladimir Putin, who, apparently, was very annoyed by the fact that the office allows itself to be used in the interests of Dmitry Medvedev's group. A week later, on April 11, 2011, on the very day when the investigators of the RF Investigative Committee broke into the cottage of the deputy premier of the regional court Gavrichkov, another turning point occurred that left no illusions about the bloodthirstiness of the undeclared war of the security forces. It was reported that one of the witnesses in the case of illegal casinos in the Moscow region, namely Alexei Prilepsky, the driver of Marat Mamiyev, Ivan Nazarov's partner in the shadow business, was killed. It turns out that he was strangled at the end of February, after the case was opened and the first defendants, including Mamiyev, were arrested. But the body of the murdered man was discovered by policemen only on April 9. On suspicion of involvement in the murder, Nikolai Zakharov, the owner of underground gambling establishments in the city of Korolev, was arrested, to whom Prilepsky came for the last meeting in his life. It also turned out that the elder brother of the murdered man, Alexander Prilepsky, worked as a driver for the gambling king, Ivan Nazarov himself, but Alexei Prilepsky was the courier who took the money to the protective prosecutors. And then Chaika realized that he should hurry. On April 14, 2011, the Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation announced that Alexander Ignatenko, first deputy prosecutor of the Moscow region, and Dmitry Yurimov, head of the Regional Prosecutor's Office for Supervision of Procedural Activities in the bodies of the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation, were dismissed for violating the prosecutor's oath. The prosecutor of the Moscow region, Alexander Mokhov, was removed from his post, and a variety of assumptions began to be expressed in the media about him. The only thing that the Prosecutor General's office could do for its former subordinates was to close the criminal cases against them, which were initiated by the Bastrykinites. But just a few days later, their situation worsened again due to the efforts of the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation. Against the background of 6 disciplinary sanctions, strict reprimand, deprivation of bonuses, etc., that Moscow region prosecutors had previously undergone, such a reaction by Yuri Chaika looked like a complete surrender of his positions. On April 15, 2011, it became known that Alexander Mokhov, the prosecutor of the Moscow region, removed from his post, was appointed deputy prosecutor of the Moscow Interregional Transport Prosecutor's Office, which for him was a demotion by 3 steps at once. But even this public humiliation of the regional prosecutor was perceived by public opinion as a manifestation of corruption within the walls of the Prosecutor General's office itself. Meanwhile, having received instructions from Dmitry Medvedev, Yuri Chaika actively demonstrated his zeal, trying to enlist the favor of the president. In just a month, the prosecutor checked 628 addresses listed on sites like Where is the Casino, discovered and closed 226 underground gambling establishments. More than 2,500 pieces of gambling equipment were seized, 15 criminal cases were opened. In fact, these results of the struggle, reported by the Prosecutor General's office, were only a drop in the ocean of gambling vice that flooded the whole country. And the president was well aware of this. Soon, on April 22, 2011, the prosecutor of the city of Noginsk, Vladimir Glebov, and the prosecutor of the city of Klin, Eduard Kaplan, were dismissed. On May 4, 2011, it became known that Alexander Ignatenko, Dmitry Yurimov, Eduard Kaplan and Vladimir Glebov were prosecuted on suspicion of taking bribes. Ivan Nazarov's accomplices, Alla Gusieva and Ivan Volkov, testified that Kaplan and Glebov received $30,000 to $35,000 monthly for protection of underground casinos. Upon learning of this, Alexander Ignatenko and Eduard Kaplan hit the run, after which they were put on the federal wanted list. This time, the Prosecutor General's office did not excuse anyone. On May 5, 2011, Vladimir Glebov, who appeared for interrogation, was detained. The court confirmed the legitimacy of the arrest of the ex-prosecutor and rejected the petition to change the preventive measure on bail of 500,000 rubles. The stakes in this game were clearly growing. On May 6, 2011, on suspicion of taking bribes, Dmitry Yurimov was taken into custody, who, by virtue of his position, significantly prevented the Bastrykinites from conducting investigative actions against the prosecutor's mafia. The arrested Yurimov asked the court to release him on bail of 3 million rubles, but everything was in vain. After that, no one could interfere with the investigators of the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation. On May 11, 2011, it became known that investigators of the RF Investigative Committee have information about the involvement in the protection of underground casinos of at least 10 more district prosecutors of the Moscow region, including the prosecutor of the city of Serpukhov, Oleg Bazilyan, who himself hurried to quit, and the prosecutor of the city of Moscow, Odintsovo Roman Niskomenko. On the same day, Dmitry Yurimov, ex-head of the regional prosecutor's office, was charged. According to the former lawyers of the arrested Ivan Nazarov and Alla Gusieva, it became known that their former clients made a deal with the investigation in exchange for the fact that they would be witnesses in the case of bribes. In addition, they were promised to be included in the witness protection program. This news immediately stirred up many who had already begun to dry crackers for a long time. The defeat of the prosecutor's mafia began to take on an avalanche-like character. During the investigation, it turned out that Moscow region prosecutors had been receiving bribes from Ivan Nazarov's people since July 2009, when all gambling establishments closed since June 1 went underground, until February 2011, when the first arrests began in the case of covering casinos. It was possible to establish that, in total, 4 prosecutors, Ignatenko, Yeremov, Kaplan and Glebov, received bribes of at least 15 million rubles, although the objectivity of this figure is doubtful, knowing the extent to which the gambling business was put underground. Another curious detail also surfaced. 29-year-old Dmitry Yeremov, accompanied by his father, Isaac Yeremov, repeatedly visited the townhouse of the former regional prosecutor Alexander Mokov. Presumably not empty-handed. In addition, a search began for the hostess of the premium restaurant near Moscow, Valentina Spirina, one of whose daughters was married to the former first deputy prosecutor of the Moscow region Alexander Ignatenko, who lay low, and the second to the head of the Organizational and Inspection Department of the Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation, Yuri Sindeev, who carried out the inspection appointed by the Prosecutor General, Ignatenko's brother-in-law and his accomplices in the protection of underground casinos. It seemed suspicious to the investigation that the organizers of illegal business transferred from 200 to 300,000 rubles a month to Spirina's bank card. On May 12, 2011, the arrested ex-prosecutor of Noginsk Vladimir Glebov was charged. By this time, no one had any illusions that the list of suspects would be closed, after which the anti-prosecution campaign would decline. And the pessimists were right. On May 13, 2011, it became known that the arrested high-ranking official of the prosecutor's office of the Moscow region, Dmitry Yeremov, also decided to make a deal with the investigation. If Yeremov speaks, tomorrow the handcuffs may end up on the wrists of ex-regional prosecutor Alexander Mokov, and then Chaika himself. Everyone understood this. But the piquancy of this situation was that such a procedure as a deal with the investigation, according to the law, must be agreed with the Prosecutor General's office. And again the bidding began, which ended with the fact that the Deputy Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation Viktor Grin refused to approve the petition of the person under investigation Yeremov to conclude a deal with the investigation. On May 16, 2011, Yuri Mikhailov, Dmitry Yeremov's lawyer, told the media that his client not only did not want to make a deal with the investigation, but did not admit his guilt at all. The investigative committee immediately struck back, which turned out to be a crushing force. On May 17, 2011, former district prosecutors Roman Nishchemenko were detained, who was immediately charged with taking bribes for 2 million rubles, and Oleg Bazilyan, the most active, according to the witness, Nikolaev, members of the Moscow OCG, organized prosecutorial/criminal group. On May 19, the court decided to take them into custody, and on June 2 issued a warrant for the arrest of Bazilyan's assistant, Mikhail Stanovich. According to media reports, Nishchemenko and Bazilyan also expressed their readiness to make a deal with the investigation, as Vladimir Glebov had already done before them. On May 18, 2011, the media reported that the main witness in the case of covering underground casinos, ex-deputy regional prosecutor Stanislav Byansky, witness Nikolaev, testified against ex-regional prosecutor Alexander Mokov, who, according to him, covered the entire criminal gang, which included about 20 active members from among the employees of the prosecutor's office, who protected underground casinos in 15 cities of the Moscow region. In addition, Byansky said that the fugitive deputy prosecutor Ignatenko went to the prosecutor general's office, not empty-handed and not only on official business. On this day, an interview with Byansky appeared on the pages of the Kommersant newspaper. At the end of May 2011, it became known that the investigative committee of the Russian Federation intensified the investigation into the case of the Ceylon's Dacha partnership, which also featured the former first deputy prosecutor Alexander Ignatenko and the arrested Ivan Nazarov. Apparently, the Bastrykinites, just in case, decided to play it safe and dig up more crime on the fugitive deputy prosecutor. In addition, after Yuri Chaika surrendered, the investigative committee finally had a real opportunity to bring the high-profile Ceylon's case, which was repeatedly closed at the initiative of the regional prosecutor's office, to court. By the way, in the framework of this criminal case, Ivan Nazarov was recognized as a victim. Ignatenko simply threw him when, having taken more than 2 million rubles from him, he did not transfer land plots to him. And they also say, a crow will not peck out the eyes of a crow. But where did the former first deputy prosecutor of the Moscow region go? According to the Moskovsky Komsomolets newspaper, Alexander Ignatenko is hiding in Ukraine, in the mining town of Rovenki, where he owns the premium nightclub, which has the same name as the former mother-in-law's restaurant near Moscow, and several mines. Formally, this whole business is registered to a half-brother, a full namesake, Alexander Ignatenko, which, you see, is at least creative. And one more thing, according to MK, in Ukraine, the fugitive prosecutor Ignatenko has the status of the head of a criminal family. And from the dawn, as you know, there is no extradition. Or is it already there? At least, Eduard Kaplan acted much more far-sightedly. As the media reported, he fled through Belarus to France, and from there to Israel, where he is now seeking citizenship. But the Jew, Kaplan certainly will not be extradited from the promised land. Although they can be planted there. And there have already been such examples. In the first days of June, when this book was already going to press, it became known that the forces of the Bastrykinites had launched a decisive offensive, and battles against corruption in the prosecutors' ranks were now being waged on the streets of the capital. On June 1, 2011, the media reported that Alexander Kozlov, deputy prosecutor of Moscow, was suspected of taking a bribe in the form of a land plot worth $180,000, which he later resold to crime boss Valery Kozeka for 2 times more. This episode of Kozlov's laborious activity dates back to the period when he was still head of the prosecutor's office in Pushkino. By the way, Ivan Nazarov's predecessor as an intermediary manager between shady and prosecutors in the Moscow region, the same Valery Kozekov, received a bullet in 2008, and then was finished off with a knife at the exit of the building of this particular prosecutor's office, when, as prosecutor, Mr. Pushkino after Kozlov was already Nishchemenko. In 2006, the alarm signal about Alexander Kozlov's involvement in the land scam was checked by, yes, the prosecutor's office of the Moscow region, well known to us, but, of course, they did not find any crime in the actions of their colleague. And a year later, Alexander Kozlov was appointed to the post of deputy prosecutor of the capital. In May 2011, while checking Kozlov's involvement in the protection of underground casinos in the Moscow region, the investigators of the RF Investigative Committee along the way decided to get acquainted with the materials of that old check, but all the necessary documents stored in the regional prosecutor's office miraculously disappeared without a trace. As practice shows, it will not take long to wait for the reciprocal move of the Bastrykinites in thimbles with the state. As soon as the scandal around underground casinos broke out, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev gave a number of instructions, including to Vladimir Putin and Alexei Kudrin, to tighten criminal and administrative legislation against persons engaged in illegal gambling business, and to strengthen state regulation measures in the lottery sector, where, as it turned out, billions of rubles are spinning almost uncontrollably. For example, it turned out that the technical regulations for lottery equipment have not yet been adopted, as a result of which its registration is not carried out, and the check of lotteries for their compliance with the approved conditions, according to the federal law on lotteries, should generally be carried out no more than once every 3 years, while the maximum period of the lottery, according to the norms of the same federal law, cannot exceed 12 months. Here you have a wonderful example of the work of the Duma lobbyists, through whose efforts this law was adopted back in 2003. I wonder if lawyer Putin read the text of this legal act when he signed it as President of Russia. Years will pass, and officially closed casinos will be converted into gaming clubs, and slot machines will work on the principle of instant lotteries, which will put honest police officers to a standstill. After the official ban on casinos, the state decided to take up the game on its own, through the organization of lotteries. New departmental lotteries are launched regularly. Last year, the Ministry of Defense announced the launch of its own lotteries. According to Spetstroy, the volume of the legal lottery market in Russia is estimated at 31 to 35 billion rubles in 2009 to 2010, and in 2012 to 2015 it will grow to 95 to 115 billion rubles. The threefold predicted growth indicates that the state authorities are simply planning to pull the money that previously went to casinos and slot machine halls, says the columnist for Polit.ru Mikhail Zakharov. But how well does the state bureaucracy manage to do this? In 2010, the Accounts Chamber of the Russian Federation conducted an audit that showed that in the Rosport Gosloto lottery, with planned revenues of 26.894 billion rubles, for the period 2006 to 2015, directed to the development of physical culture and sports, real deductions in 2008 and 2009 years amounted to only about 1.23 billion rubles, and the actual revenue in 2008 amounted to only 1.4% of the planned figure, 75.750 billion rubles over 10 years. By the way, on the official website of the VGL Gosloto, for some reason, the transfer rate to the state budget has been reduced to 18.260 billion rubles, and this is not the only discrepancy in the numbers. Another clear example, based on the results of 2008 to 2009, the real revenue of the operator of the All-Russian State Lottery, Gosloto, Orglot LLC, established in ST registration, 99% of the vote, which provided bank guarantees against future contributions to the federal budget, turned out to be 16 times less than planned. And it is not yet a fact that those who were lucky in March 2007, Gazprom Bank sold the main share in this enterprise, retaining only 49.1% of the vote. However, taking into account the fact that in April 2008 Gazprom Bank regained control over this company, 50.1% of the authorized capital, it seems that we can talk about some kind of cunning financial combination. One way or another, the auditors of the Accounts Chamber attributed everything to an incorrect assessment of the market and its growth rates, which caused only a smirk among understanding people. Since gambling is a universal thing, it is obvious that gambling money is found somewhere. Most likely, in the market of illegal casinos, from which the state does not get anything. In other words, through legislative pressure, the state tried, perhaps the officials themselves do not realize this, but they did exactly that, to enter the market that was closed to it. Now they are trying to squeeze out the already illegal gambling business by force. The only serious obstacle is the weak capacity of the state machine in the matter of systematic confrontation with the market forces. Individual officials in the process of combating something are corrupted by lobbyists, or on their own, by entering into business, concludes Polit.ru. The flight of fantasy of the guardians for state control in this area of business knows no bounds. In April 2011, Russian State Duma Deputy Vladimir Gruzdev came up with a bold initiative: why don't we make an official online casino, a kind of dedicated zone on the network? The State Department proposed to ban other similar sites under an agreement with internet providers in order to exclude unnecessary competition. It is known that the global market for such online casinos is several $1 billion a year. Given the increasing internetization of Russia, such an idea no longer seems stupid. In the end, Dmitry Medvedev's latest initiative, aimed at another attempt to regulate internet content, gives reason to believe that the country's top leadership can take the proposal of United Russia, Gruzdev, with all seriousness. In favor of this assumption are other circumstances that are not customary to advertise. First, Deputy Chairman of the Committee of the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation on Civil, Criminal, Arbitration and Procedural Legislation, member of the General Council of the United Russia VFP vs Gruzdev, is also Deputy Chairman of the Board of the Association of Lawyers of Russia, the Board of Trustees of which is headed by the President of the Russian Federation D.A. Medvedev. But even this is not the main thing. Being an officer of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation, he retired from military service in 1993 and immediately became the deputy of that same Oleg Boyko, at that time the general director of the OLBI Diplomat Company. Then he takes part in the creation of the Seventh Continent Company, which he heads. The specialized languages that Scout Vladimir Gruzdev is fluent in are Spanish and Portuguese, the main languages of Latin America, where Oleg Boyko will later start investing in the gambling business. Just a coincidence? It is not difficult to guess whose capital Boyko was adding and whose interests Gruzdev lobbied for, sitting in the State Duma since 2003. At least back in February 2008, the finance magazine estimated the assets of United Russia Vladimir Gruzdev at $1 billion, which Oleg Boyko, a gambling tycoon, could not boast of. True, in 2010, according to Forbes magazine, Gruzdev's fortune was already $950 million, which is excusable. High politics is, an expensive pleasure. And if our calculations turn out to be correct, then it will not be difficult to guess who exactly and why ordered the office and the investigative committee to hit the prosecutor general's office, which roofs underground casinos in the Moscow region and, further everywhere. The very rare case when commercial interests coincide with political ones. This time around, investing in the right Siloviki can bring much more benefits than spending on Putin's baseless fantasies. By the way, from 2002 to 2009, Vladimir Gruzdev's partner in the retail business was none other than Alexander Zanetvorov, the former co-owner and chairman of the board of Osovin Bank, which was involved in a high-profile money laundering scandal through the Bank of New York in 2000. So there are already reliable people with specific experience in the gamers team. Moreover, Alexander Zanetvorov is tied with loans worth hundreds of millions of dollars not only to Alfa Bank, but also to Mikhail Prokhorov's bank, which has recently enjoyed special confidence in the Kremlin. Was there a boy? April 29, 2011 in the Russian State Library for Youth in Moscow, President of the Russian Federation D.A. Medvedev held an informal meeting with representatives of the Russian internet community. As Interfax reported, the meeting with the head of state was attended by Press Secretary of the President of the Russian Federation Natalia Timokova, Minister of Telecom and Mass Communications of the Russian Federation Igor Shegelev, Director of the Coordination Center for the National Internet Domain Andrei Kolesnikov, as well as a number of well-known bloggers, internet publishers, heads of internet companies and social networks, including Anton Nozick, Rustam Adagamov, Maxim Moshkov, Ivan Zasursky, Dmitry Kolistikov, Sergei Grishin, My World and Odnoklasniki, and Svetlana Ivanikova, LiveJournal. In total, more than 20 people. He was listed in this list as the author of the Internet Project, Where is the Casino, and Anton Heistver, albeit with a mistake, as Hestwer. SSTU student Anton Heistver really received an invitation from the Kremlin and was planning to go to Moscow. But whether he actually got to this meeting with the president is not known for certain. At least, in the list of participants in this meeting published on the official website of the Kremlin, the name of Anton Heistver from Saratov is missing for some reason. It was not visible on the frames of the protocol shooting, which was shown on all federal television channels of the country. Anton's father, Alexei Heistver, who once worked with Vyacheslav Volodin in Saratov, is silent on this matter when communicating with fellow countrymen. And this is not the only mystery in this whole story. When this book was already going to press, events began to gain such a rapid turn that even the media barely had time to react to these new twists in the plot of the unfolding political detective story. On June 7, 2011, Ferit Temirgaliyev, head of the Department for Combating Crimes in the Telecommunications Sphere of the Directorate K of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation, and his deputy Mikhail Kulikov were detained in the case of protection of an illegal gambling business in the Moscow region. They are suspected of taking a bribe of $75,000 from the main person involved in the gambling business, Ivan Nazarov, and his assistant Marat Mamiyev. On June 9, 2011, the court, despite opposition from representatives of the Prosecutor General's office, issued a sanction for their arrest, rejecting the request for bail for Temirgaliyev in the amount of 20 million rubles. But the day before, on June 8, 2011, the same Baumani Court of Moscow refused to sanction the arrest of Anatoly Drak, the current prosecutor of the city of Ozhyora, who is also suspected of taking bribes for patronage of Nazarov's gambling empire. According to media reports, a gambling club in Ozhyry was run by a certain Yuri Vasin, who had an expired license for the lottery business and was subordinate to Marat Mamiyev. The criminal case initiated by the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation against Prosecutor Drak was cancelled on the same day by the Deputy Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation Viktor Grin. On the night of June 10, 2011, an assassination attempt was made in Saratov on the life of the publisher and founder of the Vzglyad Media Holding, a deputy of the Saratov Regional Duma, Sergei Kurikin, who initiated a large-scale fight against illegal gambling in Russia at the beginning of the year. The Mercedes, in which the parliamentarian was located, parked opposite the entrance to the City Park of Culture and Recreation, after which he was literally riddled with bullets. Sergei Kuryakin himself escaped with a minor injury, and his bodyguard was taken to intensive care in critical condition. The next morning, having learned about what had happened, Vyacheslav Volodin, Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, who had personal and business relations with Kuryakin, urgently arrived in Saratov under the guise of a 2-day vacation. On the same day, June 10, 2011, in Moscow, the main defendants in the case of underground casinos, Ivan Nazarov, Alla Gusieva and Marat Mamiyev, were released from custody on bail. The formal basis for this decision was the fact that all three were reclassified as charges under Article 171 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, illegal entrepreneurship, which does not provide for a measure of restraint in the form of arrest. After that, on June 11, 2011, a series of high-profile resignations of high-ranking generals of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation, Putin's call, followed, whom Dmitry Medvedev replaced with his appointees. Among them, First Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs Mikhail Sukhodolsky and Head of the Investigative Committee under the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia Alexei Anichin lost their posts. Finally, on June 13, 2011, President of the Russian Federation D.A. Medvedev signed the federal law, on amendments to the federal law, on state regulation of organization and conduct of gambling and on amendments to certain legislative acts of the Russian Federation, which was adopted by the State Duma on June 1, 2011 and approved by the Federation Council a week later. With his amendments, Dmitry Medvedev outlawed all bookmakers and sweepstakes, whose betting shops are located outside specially designated gambling zones, which actually means a ban on this criminal business in all cities and towns of Russia. Chapter 5. Confrontation. The resolution of the ideological conflict between Dmitry Medvedev and Vladimir Putin will determine the path that Russia will take tomorrow. Many political analysts came to this conclusion back in early 2009, when the contradictions in the actions and statements of both tandemocrats became public, and not just a narrow circle of people close to the political kitchen of the Kremlin. Long before the disagreements that arose between Medvedev and Putin in connection with the war in Libya, the Khodorkovsky case, and the protests of the non-systemic opposition, the president and the prime minister showed quite serious differences in their understanding of the strategic tasks facing the country, as well as ways to solve them. Totalist and liberal mobilist. Only the lazy did not talk about the economic crisis of 2008 to 2009 in Russia. It seems that plug in the plug from the electric kettle, and he will also talk about the notorious financial market. How did both tandemocrats react to the new challenges of our time? What exactly was the fundamental difference in their positions, if such a difference was observed in principle? June 5, 2009 Russian President Dmitry Medvedev spoke at the plenary session of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, held from June 4 to 6, 2009 in the northern capital. On the economic situation in Russia and measures to overcome the global financial crisis, Dmitry Anatolyevich, in particular, said the following. I would like to specifically emphasize that for me, as president, the absolute priority in anti-crisis measures is, of course, the social protection of people. We have given and will continue to give priority attention to this. But we will not limit ourselves to providing direct financial assistance. The most important thing now is to create conditions for improving the skills of our citizens, for their retraining, and, if necessary, for changing their specialty. At the same time, each person must understand a fairly simple thing. Today you need to become more mobile, sometimes you need to change your occupation, and even your place of residence, in order to provide both comfort for your family and education for your children. This is not only the responsibility of the state, it is the responsibility of each of us. Our task today is the formation of an intellectual, if you like, a smart economy and a corresponding society as a whole. This implies both a significantly higher quality of life and the predominance of the middle class in society, the ability to change quickly and quickly respond to a changing world. An active, competitive business class, which is the basis of economic success in developed countries, is what we need today. The president's call for mobility, addressed to the Russians, was certainly correct. However, having said A, Dmitry Medvedev should have said B. Let us recall the provisions of Article 27 of the Constitution of the Russian Federation. They fix the right of everyone who is legally located on the territory of the Russian Federation to free movement, as well as to choose a place of stay and residence. Paragraph 2 of the same article says that each of us has the right to freely travel outside the Russian Federation and return without hindrance. Calling on Russian citizens to be more mobile, not to be afraid to change their occupation, even place of residence, the President of Russia, according to the logic of his own words, should have taken a second step, providing Russians with a real opportunity to become more mobile, namely, to cancel on the territory of the Russian Federation, the institution of registration, propiska, of citizens, changing the mandatory nature of registration to notification in any simplified form, by phone, by email. These are already technical details. Abolish the practice of issuing foreign-type passports to citizens of the Russian Federation and at the same time launch a procedure for replacing current domestic Russian passports with an international standard document proving the identity of a citizen. As provided, for example, in all European countries. What was actually done? In the first half of February 2010, more than 6 months after Dmitry Medvedev's speech at the St. Petersburg Forum, the media became aware that the Federal Migration Service had begun drafting a bill that would abolish the existing registration procedure for Russian citizens at the place of residence, both permanent and temporal. It is assumed that instead of a mandatory stamp in the passport, it will be quite enough to simply notify the FMS authorities about the change of one's place of residence by mail. On February 15, 2010, the Federal Weekly Nasha Versia published an article by Igor Dmitriev from A Clean Slate. Will Russia finally abolish the registration of citizens at the place of residence, which quotes the words of Konstantin Poltorinin, deputy head of the International and Public Relations Department of the Federal Migration Service, the registration institution is outdated and must be changed. We want this to apply to both those citizens who temporarily move on the territory of the Russian Federation, and permanently residing citizens of the Russian Federation. It is necessary to make sure that a citizen applies to our service once, and we will already notify other departments, from the military registration and enlistment office to the pension fund. In the future, it will be even easier to inform the Federal Migration Service via the Internet. I would like to hope that permit registration will soon become a thing of the past. Then it was assumed that when a citizen of Russia or an immigrant receives a new passport, it will no longer be marked with registration of the place of residence. It was planned that in 2011 the bill developed in the bowels of the Federal Migration Service would be submitted for consideration by the deputies of the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation and, tentatively, from 2012 it would be put into effect. As usual, the new, quite unexpected, initiative of the FMS became the subject of lively discussions that continue to this day. It must be said that opponents of the abolition of compulsory registration now see several negative aspects of the proposed reform, namely, firstly, in their opinion, this will complicate the control over the movement of criminal elements and illegal migrants. The thesis, it must be said, is not indisputable, because now this system continues to operate, but this does not lead to cardinal success in combating the above two negative phenomena. The second disadvantage, according to opponents, is that the entire social security system of modern Russia is based precisely on a clear indication of the place of residence of the recipient of a particular social subsidy. But even this thesis, on thoughtful consideration, does not stand up to scrutiny. Practice shows that citizens in need of social security from the state and municipal authorities are not inclined to change their place of residence frequently due to quite obvious economic reasons. By the way, a year after this statement, published in our version, Konstantin Poltorinin will change his point of view and will already advocate tightening the migration legislation of the Russian Federation in order to prevent the disappearance of the white race. After that, a shout from the Kremlin will immediately follow, and the official will lose his post, which will cause a real scandal in political circles. It should be noted that the propiska institution has been operating in our country since 1932, when passports were revived for citizens of the Soviet Union. Then, first, the peasants, and a little later, the residents of the cities, were required to submit applications to the relevant authorities about changing the data on their place of residence in the event that a person lived in another place, albeit temporarily, for at least 1.5 months. In 1993, in connection with the adoption of the Constitution of the Russian Federation, the Propiska institution was formally abolished, but in reality it remained, being replaced by mandatory registration. Compulsory registration, and, in fact, the same Propiska, has since been constantly criticized as a norm that infringes on the constitutional rights of Russian citizens. Indeed, the call to become more mobile does not go very well with the current practice, changing the place of residence even within the administrative boundaries of one municipality. A citizen of the Russian Federation is obliged, to visit the regional offices of the Federal Migration Service, to register, fill out application forms, get registered, fill out application forms again. Moreover, a citizen is obliged to do this, it is obliged no later than 7 days from the moment of arrival at a new place of residence, which is determined by the legal norms of Art. 6 of the Law of the Russian Federation, on the right of citizens of the Russian Federation to freedom of movement, choice of place of stay and residence within the Russian Federation, dated June 25, 1993, number 5242-1. A citizen of the Russian Federation who has changed his place of residence is obliged no later than 7 days from the date of arrival to new place of residence to apply to the official responsible for registration, with an application in the prescribed form. We note once again that the Constitution of the Russian Federation, the basic law of the Russian Federation, does not say a word about these duties of Russian citizens. Which, in turn, makes it possible for any citizen to apply to the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation with a statement on declaring the law of the Russian Federation of June 25, 1993 unconstitutional. In addition, this law of the Russian Federation of 1993 was created when a wave of protest moods rose throughout the country, when campaigns of the People's Militia were organized in Moscow, and everything was saturated with the fear of waiting for a civil war. In principle, that then, only on a small scale, ended when the Russian parliament was shot from tank guns on the orders of President Yeltsin. Based on the notorious political expediency, the Kremlin-wise men tried in every possible way to prevent the mass movements of people, fearing an influx of unemployed miners and peasants to the capital. For this, all sorts of barriers were created, the relevant rules of law were introduced, which made it possible to apply methods of administrative or forceful coercion to anyone. But now, what is the need for this? Or, the situation can repeat itself. What is striking? The legislator does not care at all that a citizen may have many objective reasons that will prevent him from meeting the deadline allotted by law. But the main thing in this case is not even that. In general, how can such a practice of registration, that is, propiska, be combined with the calls of the President of the Russian Federation D.A. Medvedev to citizens, become more mobile? Nothing but mocking such an approach cannot be called. Also incomprehensible is the current practice of issuing citizens of the Russian Federation foreign passports with a limited validity period, the absurdity of which simply does not need comments. If you look at the current situation from the point of view of the civilized world, it will become obvious to any sane person, the practice of registration in Russia today, call it registration, it's not a matter of form, but of essence, and the issuance of passports with a limited validity period is nothing more than atavism of serfdom, abolished, as you know, by Emperor Alexander II in 1861. What is the conclusion from this? Dmitry Medvedev, by and large, has a difficult choice. There are not so many options, but in fact, two. The first option is to abolish the remnants of serfdom that remain in Russia. True, the finale for the president reformer in this situation may be similar to the fate that befell the emperor reformer in 1881, the consolation, however, may be the opportunity to remain forever in the grateful memory of contemporaries and descendants. The second option is to keep the current order of things and perhaps even tighten it. For example, following the example of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In the DPRK, the following procedure applies. If a citizen, for one reason or another, decided to change his place of residence, he submits an appropriate application to the local district committee of the WPK, Workers' Party of Korea. The issue is thoughtfully considered at the bureau of the district committee, all the pros and cons are carefully weighed, after which the applicant is either allowed to move, or, for good reasons, the application is denied. In modern Russia, the role of the North Korean TPK could well be played by the United Russia Party. Such a coordinating permissive practice, put it on a commercial footing, moreover, could significantly replenish the party budget. But jokes aside, if we look at the situation more generally, it becomes obvious, Dmitry Medvedev, as well as the senior, tan Democrat, Vladimir Putin, needs, in fact, to clearly formulate the main directions of Russia's development, outline a schedule of priority measures and begin their implementation. And these should not be general maxims like the pointless Putin's plan. Otherwise, citizens of the Russian Federation and attentive foreign observers will continue to contemplate a multi-act performance called The Triumph of Political Technologies on the Russian political stage, which began back in 1999. Which, in principle, with the creation on the eve of the Duma and presidential elections of the All-Russian People's Front for the Supreme Commander-in-Chief Putin, is happening. With the latter approach outlined above, the call of the esteemed President of Russia to its citizens to provide both comfort for your family and education for your children will, alas, remain just another populist statement by the political leadership of the country. For it is easy to assume that if the citizens of Russia in the current situation, which will not change significantly in the foreseeable future, are given a real opportunity to be more mobile, most of them will become so. Only now they will provide comfort for their family and education for their children outside the Russian Federation. But to what extent such a seemingly technical issue as the registration of citizens at the place of residence can be of fundamental importance for assessing the degree of disagreement within the ruling tandem? And what exactly is the deep essence of these contradictions? In addition to discussing the purely formal side of this problem, in our opinion, it makes sense to talk about the hidden manifestations of a personal approach to solving it on the part of both tandem Democrats. The beginning of June 2009 clearly demonstrated the existence of a serious ideological conflict between Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev. The statement of the President of the Russian Federation at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum took place on June 5, and the visit of the chairman of the government of the Russian Federation to the rebellious town of Pikalevo happened a day earlier, on June 4. The statements made by Medvedev and Putin during these significant 2 days for Russia fundamentally contradict each other in their deepest content. And that's why. To begin with, we recall that on June 2, 2009, residents of the city of Pikalevo, Leningrad region, staged a large-scale protest after 2 of the 3 city-forming enterprises closed there. Pikalevites blocked the Novaya Ladoga-Vologda federal highway, demanding to solve the problem of unemployment and wage arrears, as well as the supply of hot water and heating. Vladimir Putin, acting as the savior of the inhabitants of Pikalevo, outlined the approach that he intends to follow in resolving similar economic problems. The chairman of the party and the government made it clear that the city-forming enterprises that provide financial support for workers and their families should work regardless of the economic expediency applicable to them. This approach of the Prime Minister to solving the problems of the city-forming industrial enterprises, in social terms, very close, both in form and in essence, to serfdom, fundamentally contradicts the President's calls for Russians to be more mobile. We are not talking about what social and economic consequences the Pikalev syndrome can lead to in Russia. The residents of other problematic cities, who found themselves on the verge of survival, were given to understand that the problem can be solved in this way. And some have already followed suit. Vladimir Putin, as you can see, is a schematic and doctrinaire in his psychotype. He puts the existing state of affairs into schemes and doctrines, and seeks to squeeze certain changes that occur in the future into the framework of previously created logical constructions. A classic example of this is the so-called power vertical scheme. Pikaleyev's initiatives once again confirmed that Vladimir Vladimirovich had, figuratively speaking, a feudal, administrative command approach to the development of Russia. There is power, there is a people, the government must take care of the people, and the people must reciprocate this power. In political and philosophical terms, Vladimir Putin is a staunch follower of the so-called totalist tradition. Among the central figures of its founders and followers are Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Hegel, Kant and Marx. The totalistic tradition seeks to create a consistent and holistic theory that would fully explain the essence of what is happening. The model of Vladimir Putin's behavior, apparently, fits well into the framework of this tradition. Dmitry Medvedev, guided by the principles of reasonable non-intervention of the state in economic processes, suggests that the citizens of Russia themselves be more active, if we mean mobility by activity. Believing at the same time that the political leadership and the state apparatus should create the necessary conditions for citizens for self-realization. At the very least, rather, of course, badly, but today the state is trying to create these conditions. What, we note in passing, lies the fundamental difference between the economic policy of Dmitry Medvedev and the economic policy pursued by Yegor Gaidar in the early 1990s. The latter practically did not create conditions for the self-realization of citizens, believing that the invisible hand of the market itself would lead everyone to a world of material prosperity. In political and philosophical terms, Dmitry Medvedev is close to the mobilistic trend in philosophy, Spinoza, Hume, Leibniz, Nietzsche, Deleuze and Foucault, whose followers view life as an extremely dynamic, rather than static system, characterized by a constant conflict of multidirectional forces. Relatively speaking, Dmitry Medvedev can be called a liberal mobilist. The difference in the worldview approaches of Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev is also explained by the fact that the stages of their formation as leaders differ in time. Not very different from each other in age, in worldview they are almost complete opposites. These differences lie precisely in basic views, and not in individual details of political superstructures, for example, in personnel appointments, subjective likes and dislikes, etc. Youth of Vladimir Putin, as you know, passed in the days of developed socialism. In addition, the KGB practice left its mark, in which the construction of schemes and doctrines is a very important methodological technique. And the youth and development of Dmitry Medvedev as a politician and leader fell on perestroika and glasnost in the second half of the 1980s, and then on the dashing years of the early 1990s, that is, at a time when quick, sometimes instant changes became the determining factor for developing a model behavior and approach to solving vital problems. Many of the representatives of the current power elite in Russia are clearly not embarrassed when they are called elite. However, the elite, by definition, has not only rights, but also duties. Among these duties is the readiness of the elite to make certain sacrifices when the state and society find themselves in a difficult situation. It seems that the current political and business elite of Russia should clearly formulate, first of all, for themselves, the answer to the question, which today is the main one on the open public agenda. This question is very simple. In the event of a worsening economic situation, is the elite ready to share part of its income for the sake of the country's well-being, or will it, as before, put its own pocket above the interests of the people? Dmitry Medvedev, as can be understood from his public statements, is a supporter of the famous Lifshitz approach, we must share. But to share, the state with the people, and not to share someone else's under the guise of a state approach, as happened with Deripaska in Pikalevo, and even earlier, with Khodorkovsky. Vladimir Putin's approach, as again evident from his speeches and actions, is completely different. The government itself knows what the people need and will act as it sees fit. At the same time, both tandemocrats have a great similarity. Both, in fact, are idealists. The careers of both in the 1990s to 2000s developed rapidly. Neither Putin nor Medvedev have serious leadership experience in the real sector of the economy, except for Dmitry Anatolyevich's participation in the business projects of the timber industry giant Ilim Pulp. Both, being lawyers by education, sign normative legal acts, which sometimes come into direct conflict with the same constitution of the Russian Federation. Both of them clearly show a desire to replace the lack of a comprehensive and long-term strategy for the development of the state and society as a whole with spectacular external gestures. Well, what approach will prevail, Dmitry Medvedev's liberal mobilist approach or Vladimir Putin's administrative command, Surf-owning one? I think it will become clear very soon. Apparently, there is not much time left to wait. The institution of compulsory registration of citizens at the place of permanent or temporary residence should be abolished in any case. And in this regard, the FMS initiative deserves only approval. Unless, of course, the federal authorities come up with something similar instead, as it already happened in 1993 with propiska registration. But in this case, we are interested in a slightly different question, namely, was the initiative to abolish the institution of compulsory registration of citizens at the place of permanent or temporary residence really a manifestation of the hidden political confrontation between Dmitry Medvedev and Vladimir Putin, which has been discussed so much in the past 3 years? On this score, political analysts do not have a unanimous opinion, because individual facts and circumstances do not allow an unambiguous answer to this question. For example, on February 18, 2010, on the evening air of the Echo Moskvy radio station, a conversation took place with radio listeners, cancellation of registration in Russia, pros and cons. The host of the broadcast, Marina Koroleva, in particular, noted that on February 17, 2010, the head of the FMS, Konstantin Romodanovsky, at a meeting with Vladimir Putin, told the head of the Russian government about plans to abolish mandatory registration. Apparently, Putin did not say anything negative to him. That is, at least he did not say this: "No, this is a crazy plan, we will not cancel any registration, everything will remain as it is." Does this mean that Medvedev and Putin do not have any contradictions in terms of the internal migration reform? But then a reasonable question arises: why was it decided to carry out this reform with such a delay? Why is the bill prepared by the Federal Migration Service going to be submitted to the State Duma in 2011, and not done in 2010? Why has information been announced that the new rules can come into effect only from 2012? It is strange that a completely obvious moment that lies, so to speak, on the surface has escaped the attention of many analysts. The fact is that not only social payments and pensions, but also voter lists are tied to the place of permanent or temporary residence in Russia today. Consequently, a change in the procedure for the stay of citizens on the territory of Russia will inevitably lead to the introduction of significant changes, including in the current electoral legislation of the Russian Federation. And this will be done, apparently, precisely by 2012, exactly before the next presidential election in Russia. In this scenario, the introduction of changes in the procedure for the stay of citizens on the territory of the Russian Federation may not so much have the character of showing concern for the Russians, but rather pursue the goal of rebooting the country's electoral system, which in the new format will allow, without unnecessary problems and accusations of using administrative resources, to win whom the ruling nomenklatura elite of Russia will determine as the winner. And in this, both tandemocrats, I think, cannot have differences. Medvedev goes on the offensive, Surkov and Rakimov. The beginning of June 2009, in addition to Dmitry Medvedev's calls to the Russians to be mobile, was also marked by the activation of the first deputy head of the presidential administration of the Russian Federation, Vladislav Surkov. Vladislav Yurevich, in addition to planned trips to a number of regions of Russia, made several public statements that, at first glance, looked very strange. We can say that it was then that Vladislav Surkov actually turned into the third most influential political figure in Russia. But first, let's recall some of the most significant events of those days. On June 11, 2009, Ekaterinburg News, an information portal of Ekaterinburg, citing a publication in the Kommersant newspaper, reported on a meeting of the mayors of the Ural cities, which was held by the first deputy head of the administration of the President of the Russian Federation V.Yu. Surkov. Vladislav Yurevich lifted the veil over the mysterious future of the country for the municipal heads of the Urals. From Surkov, the dumbfounded mayors heard a terrible thing. They say, it may well happen soon that United Russia will become an opposition party. Moreover, Surkov advised the meeting participants to start building new relationships with the opposition, so that tomorrow the current opposition parties will treat United Russia, which has gone into opposition, as delicately as it treats them today. Absolutely everyone refused to comment on this information, both the press services of the Ural mayors' offices and representatives of United Russia itself. On the same day, June 11, 2009, President of the Russian Federation D.A. Medvedev met for the first time with representatives of non-parliamentary opposition parties of almost all spectrums, from Patriots of Russia to Yabloko. On June 18, 2009, Vladislav Surkov spoke to young parliamentarians in the State Duma of the Russian Federation with theses, which caused a mass citation, both in print and electronic media. In his speech, Surkov spoke in fact about the same thing as at a meeting with the mayors of the Ural cities. Plus, he made a special emphasis on the need for further development of the existing party system in Russia. The political system in Russia as a whole has developed, stabilized and fulfills its function, for parliamentary parties express and convey the entire range of significant opinions of society. We believe that if the system has taken place, there should be more degrees of freedom inside it. We must be flexible, we must be able to join coalitions. Democracy is a compromise. Democracy is a procedure. It's boring, but it's a procedure. You have to be able to join coalitions. It will take another 2 years for everyone to understand what kind of coalition Surkov was talking about then. And after that, who will believe that the idea of /U200B/U200 creating the All-Russian Popular Front, ONF, belongs personally to Comrade Putin VV? Although, to be honest, we are more concerned about another question: how many fronts did Surkov himself work or still continue to work? One can, of course, assume something else, that the idea of creating the ONF, which quietly matured 2 years ago in the bowels of the presidential administration of the Russian Federation, was originally intended for Putin, whose return to the Kremlin could be in doubt. And Putin, as time has shown, took advantage of this algorithm. But then again we return to the original question: on whose mill is Surkov pouring water? Or is it intended to be the connecting umbilical cord of the two parts of the ruling tandem? And again, there are more questions than answers. In addition, Vladislav Surkov, speaking in the State Duma of the Russian Federation in June 2009, voiced another very fundamental thought: we must understand that our common task is to preserve order. Political instability is dangerous for people's lives. The point of democracy is to minimize violence in society. Hasty reforms, a perverted understanding of democracy as a lack of order, lead to the death of people. Let's remember the 90s. Recall the sapper shovels in Tbilisi. Let's remember Baku. Recall that we have a whole people, the Meskhetian Turks, emigrated to America. Let's remember Chechnya. Do we need it? Democracy is order. Better, perhaps, even Putin will not say. The next day, June 19, 2009, Vladislav Surkov arrived in Bashkiria on a working visit, where he met with the President of the Republic, Murtaza Rakhimov. The vast majority of observers associated this visit with an interview with M.G. Rakhimov, which was published 2 weeks earlier, on June 5, 2009, in the Moskovsky Komsomolets newspaper. This interview caused a real scandal in the political circles of Russia. Commenting on the statements of Murtaza Rakhimov in Nezavisimaya Gazeta on June 6, 2009, Andrei Isaev, Deputy Secretary of the Presidium of the General Council of United Russia, expressed confidence that with his revelations, the Bashkir president offended the party in which he himself is a member. The reaction of United Russia, Isaev said, will follow immediately. Murtaza Rakhimov will be expelled from its composition and deprived of party support. In the same Nezavisimaya Gazeta, political scientist Stanislav Belkovsky commented on the situation in a similar vein: it is clear that the chair under Murtaza Rakhimov is rocking. And this is not due to any political strategy of the Kremlin, but only to the fact that too many complaints have accumulated against Rakhimov. It is clear that Vladislav Surkov's visit to Ufa was considered by many as the arrival of a guardsman, but in the end, the unexpected happened. On June 20, 2009, the Kommersant newspaper drew the final line under the Bashkir history. In the article, Murtaza Rakhimov declared legally capable, the following was said about the results of Vladislav Surkov's visit to Bashkiria: Murtaza Rakhimov's interview with the newspaper Moskovsky Komsomolets. Mr. Surkov called it an accident. United Russia reported that at a meeting with party activists, the Bashkir Republican organization United Russia. Mr. Surkov said that Murtaza Rakhimov's interview and the reaction to it were in the past, and asked not to disturb the public anymore, and also promised to take into account the interests of regional authorities in a number of issues, for example, to listen to the opinion of the regional parliament in choosing the head of the subject. Moreover, one of the party functionaries of the Bashkir ER shared with Kommersant what he heard at this meeting. Mr. Surkov assured us that the Republic is not threatened with a change of power, noting that Murtaza Rakhimov is a capable president and that he must work. As you know, just a year later, on July 12, 2010, under pressure from the Kremlin, M.G. Rakhimov, at a meeting with the head of the presidential administration of the Russian Federation, Sergei Naryshkin, will declare his intention to leave his post ahead of schedule. And on July 15, 2010, the president of the Russian Federation D.A. Medvedev will gladly accept the resignation of M.G. Rakhimov from the post of president of the Republic of Bashkortostan. Curtain. And again, it turns out that Dmitry Anatolyevich and the first deputy head of his administration, Vladislav Yuryevich, either radically disagreed, which indicates Putin's influence on Surkov, or Surkov himself deliberately misled the public about the Kremlin's plans for Rakhimov. And how to explain the fact that Rakhimov, who criticized Putin's United Russia, received his resignation instead of Medvedev's favor? Or is all this an exquisite revenge of Putin, who, while maintaining a huge influence on the president, forced him to send Rakhimov to rest? Let's try to figure this out. It is well known that Murtaza Rakhimov was distinguished by his extreme caution and ability to maneuver effectively in the conditions of a sharply and rapidly changing political situation. In this he did not differ much in his Eastern mentality from his fellow neighbor Mintimer Shemiev. As an explanation for why Rakhimov allowed himself such sharp attacks against the party of power, one had to hear the following version. They say, the situation in Russia, aggravated by the crisis of 2008 to 2009, began to enter such a steep peak that even such thoughtful people, like Murtaza Rakhimov, could no longer be silent. Version, frankly, junk. Rakhimov had something to lose. Even now, having lost almost everything, he continues to control about 63 billion rubles accumulated in his Ural Charitable Foundation, named after his son. And this kind of opposition, which Rakhimov showed with his criticism of United Russia, and would not at all make it easier for him to find compromises with the federal center. In addition, Murtaza Gabaidulovich's sharp interview with Moskovsky Komsomolets surprisingly coincided in time with the theses about the possible departure of ER to the opposition, which Vladislav Surkov voiced a couple of weeks later. It is possible that the interview of the president of the National Republic Rakhimov was agreed with the Kremlin. But for what? To try to understand this, let us briefly retell the essence of M.G. Rakhimov to the Federal Center and United Russia. So, in an interview with Moskovsky Komsomolets, Murtaza Rakhimov, in particular, said that in Russia there is a bias towards excessive centralization. And if only this. In his interview, Rakhimov appeared before the readers of MK as a real dissident. We now have everything planted from above. The level of centralization is even worse than in Soviet times. There is a policy of distrust and disrespect towards the locals. I consider it wrong, for example, that in recent years local personnel in the regional offices of federal departments have been replaced by those sent from the center. Another example is United Russia. I just read that the United Russia Party should be independent, not under the paw of the governor. As a role model, they cite the Soviet situation, when the chairman of the Regional Executive Committee reported to the first secretary of the Regional Committee of the CPSU. Sorry, but the basis of the party must be formed from below. And we don't see it yet. The party is trying to steer the people who did not command even 3 chickens. Can it be so? It's too bad that one party controls everything. There must be at least 2 parties, just like in England and America. In one, of course, Murtaza Gabaidulovich turned out to be clearly wrong, about the 3 hens. Recall that at the time when Rakhimov gave an interview, it was Vyacheslav Volodin who tried to steer the party, whose first political mentors in the Saratov region, where he comes from, were just people from the poultry industry. These chicken probes, as the people called them, had a huge impact on the formation of the political climate in the region, which Igor Gamayanov, a columnist for Literaturnia Gazeta, once called a region with chicken brains. Therefore, they commanded chickens, and even not 3. An indirect confirmation that Murtaza Rakhimov was aware of what he was saying is an interview with the state advisor to the president of Bashkiria, political scientist Sergei Lavrentiev. Rakhimov's advisor spoke about the United Russia Party no less sharply than his patron. She, in my opinion, is an inflated figure. Its top, firstly, is not an association of like-minded people, comrades in arms for a better world order of Russians, but a company of careerists and opportunists. Which, moreover, breeds in its ruling elite hardened officials and bureaucrats, far from the people, their voters. The electorate, in a word, whose fate is the same, to be intensively fooled in the next pre-election period. With such an attitude towards its role in the public life of the country, the party in power will not last long. Rakhimov warned United Russia about this in his interview. The current situation in the country, in my opinion, already predicts a similar outcome for United Russia. Let's remember the Bashkir proverb, "You are a mullah, I am a mullah, and who will give hay to a horse?" So, the party leadership of United Russia today does not have people who are ready to honestly, conscientiously work with the electorate. Where are our party leaders, leaders of parliamentary factions representing United Russia in the State Duma? Who saw them, whom did they listen to, how did they help? They flash only at Moscow parties, on trips abroad, and at rare ritually organized events. After such harsh statements and the subsequent campaign of criticism against M.G. Rakhimov, which was heard in a number of central print, on-air and online media, the end of the scandal looked completely atypical, which Georgy Chizhov, Deputy General Director of the Center for Political Technologies, noted in a comment to the Kommersant newspaper. We are faced with an unusual political practice, when dialogue followed instead of punishment. Perhaps the Kremlin has recognized that the vertical of power has been built, the country is manageable, and we can recall the federal structure of the state. It will be interesting if this marks a new stage in relations between the center and the regions. But no new stage in relations between the center and the regions, as time has shown, did not follow after that. Most likely, the reason for the short-term Rakhimov's paradox was completely different. Belkovsky, triumvirate instead of tandem. In the midst of the Bashkir scandal, on June 14, 2009, the well-known political scientist and political strategist Stanislav Belkovsky published the article, Triumvirate, in which he briefly spoke the essence of the contradictions that arose between Dmitry Medvedev and Vladimir Putin. Belkovsky rightly noted that in the conditions of the economic crisis, the struggle of the key influence groups of modern Russia for scarce resources, economic, administrative, power, etc., is objectively escalating. And in such a situation, some powerful groups of influence begin to rely on the president, while others continue to count on the prime minister. The intraspecies struggle between representatives of the ruling elite is sometimes carried out for destruction and, alas, does not imply a long-term consensus, notes Stanislav Belkovsky. And therefore, both Medvedev and Putin, often against their will, find themselves at the forefront of lobbying and business interests that directly contradict each other. In addition, the Prime Minister often forgets that foreign and defense policy is not within his sphere of competence. An example of this is the regular statements of VV Putin on the problem of the South Kuril Islands, and on the situation in Libya. You can add today, author. Vladimir Putin's incursion into the territory of presidential powers causes a painful reaction in the Kremlin. Dmitry Medvedev, Belkovsky pointed out, has already sent hardware signals that the chairman of the government should somewhat moderate activity on the foreign policy front, for which the head of state is entirely responsible. Belkovsky also noted the psychological moments in the relationship between the two leaders. Putin, among other things, is dissatisfied with the fact that the liberal intelligentsia, as well as the Western establishment, treat Medvedev much better than his predecessor. Endless talk about the thaw, about that the president will soon have to get rid of the prime minister, simply infuriates the head of the government. Putin is also annoyed by the excessive, from his point of view, public activity of the wife of the head of state. This was not observed under the first two presidents of the Russian Federation. Medvedev, in turn, is extremely annoyed by the incessant rumors and leaks according to which the president will soon resign early and give way to Putin. The tandem is not harmonized by all sorts of arguments that the real power in the country belongs to the ex-president, who is allegedly considered and called chief by most of the federal bureaucracy. Another point of contention is the United Russia Party, the beloved child of the Russian political elite. On the one hand, ER is used to being the party of the Kremlin and receiving direct instructions from the presidential structures. On the other hand, there is the leader of the party, Vladimir Putin, who no longer works in the Kremlin. It is not clear to whom to obey now, having received mutually exclusive instructions from the President of the Russian Federation and their own leader. United Russia ceases to work altogether in the hope that over time everything will somehow clear itself up. This is the reason, in particular, for the decrease in the volume and quality of the lawmaking activity of the United Russia in recent months. In order for the Medvedev-Putin tandem to become more stable, Stanislav Belkovsky proposed an original recipe, to introduce a third person into the tandem, turning the tandem into a triumvirate. This triumvirate will look like this: President of the Russian Federation, Chairman of the Government of the Russian Federation, Vice President of the Russian Federation. He is also the head of the presidential administration of the Russian Federation. The personal composition of the triumvirate is as follows: Dmitry Medvedev, Vladimir Putin and Vladislav Surkov. According to Belkovsky, it is necessary to revive the position of Vice President of the Russian Federation. He believes that the relevant amendments to the Constitution of the Russian Federation can be made in 1.5 to 2 months, on the important condition, if the organization of the process is directly handled by the Kremlin's curator of internal politics, Surkov, and not by the sluggish and little authoritative for the main composition of the State Duma, St. Petersburg lawyers. In the Constitution of the Russian Federation, it is necessary to fix the norm according to which the Vice President of the Russian Federation is the head of the administration of the President of the Russian Federation ex officio. For the first time, the Vice President of the Russian Federation can be appointed by the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation on the basis of the proposal of the President of the Russian Federation, similar to how the Chairman of the Government of the Russian Federation is empowered today. But from 2012, we should move to direct popular elections. The President of the Russian Federation should be elected together with the Vice President and the Prime Minister, whose term of office will correspond to the term of the presidential government. According to Stanislav Belkovsky, Medvedev, Putin and Surkov will go to the 2012 elections together. Their triumvirate, therefore, will rule Russia until at least 2018, when the second term of office of Dmitry Medvedev expires. The term of office of the President of the Russian Federation, as we remember, was extended from 4 to 6 years by the decision of the State Duma of the Russian Federation in 2008. The stability of such a structure, according to Belkovsky, will be explained by the fact that all members of the triumvirate, the President of the Russian Federation, the Vice President of the Russian Federation and the Chairman of the Government of the Russian Federation, will be equal in their legitimacy, which will make senseless any apparatus intrigues between them, and also exclude the possibility their involuntary resignation from their posts before the expiration of the period stipulated by the Constitution of the Russian Federation. Concluding his opus, Stanislav Belkovsky expressed his heartfelt gratitude to the Department for Internal Policy of the Administration of the President of the Russian Federation for their help in preparing the material. In general, he is still a PR man. And now let's analyze how viable the political structure proposed by Belkovsky is, and most importantly, how feasible it is in the context of the current pre-election situation. As you know, in politics much more important is not what was said aloud, but precisely what was not said at all. And the case of Murtaza Rakhimov is an example of this. Let's look at the situation from a conspiracy point of view. Will the senior tandemocrat Vladimir Putin agree with this scheme? After all, such a development of events would be very beneficial for Dmitry Medvedev. Because the Constitution of the Russian Federation has already been amended, according to which the term of office of the President of the Russian Federation has been extended from 4 to 6 years. With the introduction of these changes to the Constitution of the Russian Federation, a legal rule known as "the law has no retroactive effect" automatically began to operate. Which means in our case, the presidential term of Dmitry Medvedev, which began in May 2008, does not deprive him of the right to stand as a candidate for the highest elective position in the country 2 more times. After all, in 2008 he was elected according to the constitution in its previous edition. In addition, there are precedents. President of the RSFSR B.N. Yeltsin, after changing the basic law and the adoption of the Constitution of the Russian Federation, ran twice more for the post of president of the country. Or, the situation in the regions, when the presidents of the national republics or the governors of the regions went to the 3rd election term, citing the fact that appropriate changes were made to the charters and constitutions of the constituent entities of the Russian Federation, as a result of which the countdown of the terms of government began anew. And these charters and constitutions, by the way, had the status of state legal acts. It seems that, as a lawyer, Dmitry Medvedev understands this legal conflict very well. Lawyer Vladimir Putin, presumably, this also cuts through. Isn't that why Vladimir Vladimirovich had such a sour expression on his face when in the autumn of 2008 in the Georgievsky Hall of the Kremlin, President of the Russian Federation D.A. Medvedev read out his first annual address to the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation, in which for the first time he voiced the theses on a 6-year presidential term. Frames are everything. Needless to say, the triumvirate political project proposed by Stanislav Belkovsky, based on the matrix of 3 forces of influence, compiled within the framework of his theory by military analyst Vladimir Kalivarov back in 2007, upon closer examination, is still an unlikely scenario for the development of the socio-political situation in the country. Moreover, Belkovsky's proposals are very reminiscent of a cover for some really unfolding political processes, the Great Game, which already started in 2009. One thing is clear, the conflict between Medvedev and Putin not only became apparent, it expanded more and more 2 years ago, which did not go unnoticed by thoughtful observers. Back in March 2009, the influential American magazine, Foreign Policy, published an article, Medvedev Makes His Move, in which it was noticed that in personnel policy Dmitry Medvedev defiantly went against Vladimir Putin, starting to appoint new managers to key positions in the government of the Russian Federation. Announced in the summer of 2008, the recruitment campaign was supposed to be a response to problems with attracting competent personnel to the civil service, which indirectly again reflected Medvedev's critical view of Putin's personnel policy. With the resignation of Vladimir Putin from the post of President of the Russian Federation, the absence of a reliable system for recruiting personnel for the civil service was highlighted and the urgent need to call on a new generation of managers was realized. Foreign Policy rightly noted, Medvedev, instead of giving the advantage to United Russia, recruited communists, nationalists and liberals alike to his personnel reserve. Although many of his Golden Thousand played important roles during Putin's rule, the former president's closest allies do not appear to be on the list. Through this move, Medvedev is trying to spearhead a generational change in the Russian leadership. According to the article's authors, Ethan Berger and Mary Holland, Putin may have sealed his own fate by setting a legal precedent for his resignation. As you know, shortly after Boris Yeltsin appointed him acting president of the Russian Federation on December 31, 1999, Vladimir Putin issued Decree No. 1763, which guaranteed B.N. Yeltsin and members of his family lifelong immunity from criminal prosecution, administrative sanctions, arrest, detention, inspection and interrogation. If the situation escalates, it will not be difficult to imagine D.A. Medvedev offering V.V. Putin the same conditions. If the two leaders fail to strike a deal behind the scenes, then Dmitry Medvedev may decide to use the new anti-corruption law against Vladimir Putin's cronies, if not Putin himself. Under Putin, the authors of Foreign Policy note, corruption grew by leaps and bounds, with little or no oversight from law enforcement agencies, legislators, the media, or civil society. Even worse, the Prime Minister himself and his closest associates are involved in it. Russian political analyst Stanislav Belkovsky, a man of knowledge, gave sensational interviews to Die Welt and The Guardian in November 2007, in which he claimed that Putin had a fortune of approximately $40 billion. According to him, Putin actually owns 37% of Surgutneftgaz, $18 billion, 4.5% of Gazprom, $13 billion, and half of Gunvor, a Swiss-registered oil trader, $10 billion, run by a former agent. KGB from St. Petersburg. If this is true, Putin is one of the richest people in Europe, and perhaps in the world. And also one of the most corrupt. And if in economically favorable times most Russians preferred to ignore it, in difficult times they may demand that he be held to account. Well, again, the same Stanislav Belkovsky. The same Stanislav Belkovsky, who was one of the authors of the famous analytical report of 2003, after which the tax and then criminal prosecution of Mikhail Khodorkovsky and the Yukos concern headed by him began. However, let's get back to where we started. Of particular interest in 2009 were Vladislav Surkov's quite frequent trips to the regions of Russia. The visit to Bashkiria mentioned above is a landmark in this regard. What could Surkov and the head of the Republic of Bashkortostan MG discuss? Rakimov? What could unite their interests so much that Murtaza Gubaidulovich was entrusted with the right to publicly obstruct the notorious party of power? It is easy to imagine what exactly the heads of the subjects of the Federation, including Murtaza Rakimov, could be interested in prolonging their powers or in transferring power to people under their control for their own benefit. The Kremlin, represented by Vladislav Surkov, if we assume that Surkov expressed the interests of Medvedev, could well offer the heads of the subjects quite acceptable conditions for them. But in exchange for what? Russian political practice in recent years has revealed a very stable trend. Very often, it is during the summer lull, during the period of mass recreation and the departure of Russians to summer cottages, that the political configuration of the near future begins to take shape. Behind-the-scenes negotiations are actively conducted, agreements are reached, tactical and strategic alliances are formed and terminated. In the same way, the All-Russian People's Front, with Putin at the head, was muddied for the May holidays. And in the autumn, as experience again shows, something happens that radically changes the entire political landscape, some, God forbid, of course. New Beslan or Nordost. Most likely, the active political gestures of the summer of 2009 were of the same preparatory nature. And public statements, such as the above speeches and proposals voiced by Vladislav Surkov, Murtaza Rakimov, Stanislav Belkovsky and others, could play the role of a red herring. Apparently, for the fall of 2009, something radical was started. Perhaps early elections of deputies of the State Duma of the Russian Federation with the subsequent disposal of Putin in the White House. Medvedev, go ahead. Political analysts rarely agree on exactly when a given election campaign begins. Especially when it comes to the presidential elections in Russia. But practically none of them seriously consider that the presidential race begins exactly when the main contender officially declares this. As political practice shows, and not only in the recent history of Russia, the real actions of the campaign headquarters begin long before the public announcement of the nomination of a candidate. In essence, the start of the campaign to elect Dmitry Medvedev for a second presidential term was given back in the first 10 days of September 2009, when, according to the established Russian tradition, a new political season opened. This conclusion indirectly confirms the fact that even then Dmitry Anatolyevich was not going to comply with the agreements with Vladimir Vladimirovich regarding the transfer of presidential powers to him in 2012, if such agreements actually took place. On the morning of September 10, 2009, on the popular internet portal Gazeta.ru, published a program article signed by Dmitry Medvedev, Forward Russia, the release of which not only became a landmark event of the year, but also determined the political course of the current president of Russia at least for the entire pre-election perspective. The very fact that the program address of the President of the Russian Federation D.A. Medvedev was published on the opposition Party of Power information resource, has already talked about a lot and therefore, of course, did not go unnoticed by all sorts of political scientists and analysts. It was after this event that all illusions disappeared that the split in the ruling tandem was real, not imaginary. Recall that the newspaper Ru is one of the most successful internet projects of Gleb Pavlovsky's Effective Politics Fund, which was launched back in February 1999 by a well-known startup manager and online journalist Anton Nozick, Dmitry Medvedev's current Twitter friend. Since June 2008, the online publication Gazeta RU became completely controlled by the internet company SUP, loyal to the Kremlin, which, among other things, owns the social network LiveJournal so beloved by the president. So for Runet connoisseurs, the appearance of Dmitry Medvedev's program article in Gazeta RU was not such a complete surprise, as some researchers try to present it. And now let's focus our attention on the content of the article itself, the text of which, apparently, was prepared with the active participation of all the same employees of the FEP. The fact that this address of the head of state was not prepared by the speechwriters of the official press service of the Kremlin is indicated, among other things, by incorrect spelling with a lowercase letter of those words that, in accordance with the current legislative and grammatical norms, must be written with a capital letter, such as the President, if we mean the President of the Russian Federation, the Federal Assembly and the State Duma, if we mean the State Duma of the Russian Federation. Agree that for highly experienced members of the Presidential Press Service such misprints in an already published publication are an unforgivable thing. But for all sorts of internet journalists, political publicists and PR consultants who do not pay much attention to the written speech protocol, this is just in the order of things. It is possible that the press service of the President of Russia itself was faced with the fact of publishing this fateful article. What is it about? As follows from the introductory paragraph, the main purpose of this address by Dmitry Medvedev is, a. to express his own idea of the strategic tasks that we have to solve, and b. to invite everyone who has something to say to participate in the discussion about present and future of our country. In the very first lines, the President asks the question, should we continue to drag into our future a primitive resource-based economy, chronic corruption, an old habit of relying on the state to solve problems? In fact, we are talking about the main features of the era of Putin's rule, which, and this Medvedev does not deny, also characterized the first 2 years of his presidency. So, does Russia, overloaded with such burdens, have its own tomorrow? The President asks, but he is in no hurry to answer this question. After a few paragraphs of patriotic rhetoric, Dmitry Medvedev moves on to a brief assessment of the current state of affairs, which are far from being the best. The impressive list of problems identified by the President can be conditionally divided into several thematic blocks. The economic block is presented as follows: 1. Humiliating dependence on raw materials, from which the country has not got rid of over 20 years of reforms. 2. An economy that largely ignores human needs. 3. A business that, with a few exceptions, does not invent, does not create things and technologies that people need, but trades in what was not made by them, raw materials or imported goods. 4. Extremely low competitiveness of domestic production. 5. Shamefully low energy efficiency and productivity of most of our enterprises, with indifference to this problem on the part of owners, directors, chief engineers and officials. 6. Extreme instability of the Russian stock market. 7. Insufficient degree of Russia's influence at the level of global economic processes. The social bloc looks no better. 1. Population decline, which the emerging birth rate growth is not yet compensating. 2. Alcoholism and smoking. 3. Traffic accidents. 4. Insufficient availability of many medical technologies. 5. Environmental problems that shorten the lives of millions of people. As a result of socio-economic problems, according to Medvedev, problems of a socio-political nature also remain unresolved, namely, 1. Terrorist attacks on Russia continue, which are performed with the support of international gangs. 2. Low quality of democratic institutions. 3. Weak civil society. 4. Low level of self-organization and self-government. So, an inefficient economy, a semi-Soviet social sphere, a fragile democracy, negative demographic trends, an unstable Caucasus. These are very big problems even for a state like Russia, sums up Dmitry Medvedev. In fact, the President of the Russian Federation states, if not a complete collapse, then at least the insignificance of the results of many years of Putin's rule of the country. What is this if not an open challenge to Vladimir Putin? By the way, in this regard, let us allow ourselves one historical comparison, not quite correct in form, but very true in essence. During the same 8 years as head of state, Adolf Hitler, who also neglected the institutions of true democracy and leaned on the party and administrative resources of the NSDAP, managed to bring Germany to the position of world leadership. Any serious scholar studying the history of the Third Reich will confirm that in the period from 1933 to 1941, Germany, which inherited much bigger problems than Putin's Russia from Yeltsin's past, made a grandiose socio-economic, scientific, technical and military political breakthrough, bringing almost all of Europe to its knees. Is the key to success in the criminal fascist ideology? Of course not. Or, someone thinks otherwise. However, Dmitry Medvedev himself, of course, does not resort to such impermissible insolence parallels. On the contrary, he kind of apologizes to Putin for the categoricalness of his conclusions. Of course, you shouldn't exaggerate. A lot is being done. Russia is working. But at the same time, he adds, it is impossible to achieve leadership by relying on the oil and gas situation. In the end, it is not commodity exchanges that should decide the fate of Russia, but our own idea of ourselves, our history and our future. This is the verdict of Putin's economic model, and there is another very important point to which special attention should be paid. In the above list of the most basic problems of the country, which Medvedev inherited from Putin's rule, socio-economic problems dominate in their numbers, for the solution of which the relevant ministries and departments of the government of the Russian Federation, led by Putin, are responsible. Further, Dmitry Medvedev reveals the essence of neglected social ills that fetter the country's creative energy and hinder our common movement forward. Among these, the president refers, again, the age-old economic backwardness, the habit of subsisting on the export of raw materials, the age-old corruption that has exhausted Russia from time immemorial, and the redundancy of the state, widespread paternalistic sentiments in society and, as a result, lack of initiative, lack of new ideas, unresolved issues, poor quality of public discussion, including critical speeches. In essence, Medvedev again repeats the theses voiced above, which, by the way, betrays a collective approach in the structure of the text and the absence of an experienced hand of an editor from the Kremlin press service. In the course of a number of lyrical digressions on the theme of inertia of thinking and national traditions in the spirit of the publicism of the mythoclastic deputy Vladimir Medinsky, discussions about the nature of time and a short historical digression, the author casually blurts out, today, for the first time in our history, we have a chance to prove to ourselves and around the world that Russia can develop along a democratic path. That the transition of the country to the next, higher level of civilization is possible. And that it will be carried out by non-violent means. What exactly is this historical opportunity? What higher stage of civilization are we talking about? Judging by the further text of the manifesto, such a miracle weapon for Russia, capable of making a historical turning point in the war for survival and ensuring the country's transition to the civilizational level of Prokhonov's Russian Cosmism, is modernization. But we will return to this topic a little later, but for now, about the reaction in public opinion that such a loud public statement of the president caused. Time has shown that the discussion has gone according to a well-worn scenario. Although, in fact, in Dmitry Medvedev's statement, as you have already seen, there were very interesting passages, but for some reason they were out of the discussion area. We only note that numerous commentators quite predictably divided into two categories, for and against. But practically none of them raised the question point blank, why, after such an essentially anti-Putin statement, Putin himself did not resign. And if Medvedev, as they say, has a thin gut, then why was it necessary to submit these anti-Putin theses for public discussion? For many, by the time of Medvedev's address, it became quite obvious that, working as one of the highest officials of the government of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin will constantly act as an insurmountable obstacle for Dmitry Medvedev and be a brake on all of Russia. Were there formal reasons for President Medvedev to fire Prime Minister Putin? Of course there were. Moreover, all of them could be combined in a short formulation: the inefficiency of the work of the cabinet of ministers during the crisis period. For example, Vladimir Putin at the end of the summer of 2009 said that Russia had passed the bottom of the crisis, which, from the point of view of a detailed economic analysis, looked more than controversial at that time, and the measures taken by the government of the Russian Federation to overcome the crisis proved to be very timely and efficient. Did you save the Russian banking system by injecting hundreds of billions of rubles? And then, at whose expense? Remember, the real sector of the economy was then experiencing colossal problems, and the Putin government did not lift a finger. The president's calls for Russians to be more mobile, Dmitry Anatolyevich's declarations about the need to build an innovative economy were completely ignored by Putin's cabinet of ministers. What is worth one, pension reform, launched by him in 2009, according to which, starting from 2011, the tax pressure on business has increased dramatically. Moreover, this pressure has become especially difficult for the basis of a market economy, small and medium-sized businesses. More on this in the third chapter of our book. Only when deeds follow Medvedev's word will we be able to verify the sincerity of his words. In the meantime, the statements of Dmitry Anatolyevich are just shaking the air. Alas, in a little over a year of his tenure as President of Russia, nothing significant has been done. This was the main conclusion of independent analysts. Over the past 2 years, the opinions of many of them have changed significantly. This is how Dmitry Medvedev saw Russia's democratic future. The leaders in the political struggle will be parliamentary parties, periodically replacing each other in power. Parties and their coalitions will form federal and regional executive bodies, and not vice versa, nominate candidates for the post of head of state, heads of regions and local self-government. They will have a long experience of civilized political competition. The political system will be updated and improved in the course of the free competition of open political associations. Please note that even then, in Medvedev's address, as well as in Surkov's speeches, the words, parties and their coalitions, political associations, were heard, which only now began to reflect the realities of the country's public life. Another thesis of Dmitry Anatolyevich looks much more interesting: the spread of modern information technologies, to which we will assist in every possible way, provides unprecedented opportunities for the implementation of such fundamental political freedoms as freedom of speech and assembly. To identify and eliminate pockets of corruption. For direct access to the location of almost any event. For the direct exchange of opinions and knowledge of people around the world. Society is becoming open and transparent as never before. Even if the ruling class doesn't like it. Information technology, as you know, is one of the priorities of the current president of Russia. But where do these technologies inevitably lead? We have already mentioned the Swedes Alexander Bard and Jan Söderqvist, who were the authors of the book Netocracy. The New Ruling Elite and Life After Capitalism. They quite rightly pointed out one unique feature of the so-called information society. Its distinguishing feature is that technology itself as a cultural phenomenon has become the focus of public attention. But the actual content of the information is of relatively little interest. Although any sane person understands that information and knowledge are not the same thing. And the emerging new class of masters of the world, Bard and Söderqvist call them netocrats, are well aware of this nuance. Whoever controls new technologies and their application, right, the advanced Swedes, rapidly accumulates considerable power, which immediately leads to the consolidation of this newly formed group and a powerful impulse to protect its interests. It is understandably difficult to expect this group to be willing to make its exclusive knowledge widely available, as this would devalue both its power and its privileges. One of the ways in which the winners manipulate public consciousness is by their statements that there are no winners and losers, in fact, and the benefits that the new technology brings will be evenly and fairly distributed among all. The flow of information is not at all an unpredictable phenomenon and by no means an accidental lottery win that falls to the lot of citizens and consumers. In fact, it is a conscious strategy to maintain control over society. Interested power groups are leaking confusing information on us to keep certain essential knowledge secret. In times of dictatorship, the apparatus of power cuts off the flow of information with the help of censorship, thus making itself inaccessible. But by flooding every channel with a stream of incoherent information, a democracy's power elite, the well-organized lobby groups and powerful media conglomerates, can effectively achieve the same result. Whatever the facts, there are immediately facts that refute them. Any scientific report that presents disturbing data is immediately refuted by another, more encouraging one. And so on. Eventually, it all goes back to business as usual. It looks like a viable democracy, but it's nothing more than a spectacle for the masses. Now reread what Dmitry Medvedev wrote about information technologies and how open and transparent they will make Russian society. Need comments? Too much information and too little context are two sides of the same coin. After reading Dmitry Medvedev's article, Forward Russia, we certainly received a lot of information. But how much did we learn about what Dmitry Anatolyevich intended to do? The devil hides behind the details. May 2010 marked 2 years since Dmitry Medvedev took office as President of Russia. In other words, Dmitry Anatolyevich has already served half of his presidential term. In connection with this date, a wide variety of comments and forecasts were voiced regarding how relations in the Medvedev-Putin tandem would develop in the future and how the campaign for the election of the President of Russia in 2012 would look like. During these 2 years, a lot of speculation has been built up as to whether Dmitry Medvedev is, so to speak, a technical president or not. In particular, thoughts were expressed that in Russia, and not only in our country, no one gives up power just like that. And if so, then President Dmitry Medvedev, according to this logic, should take concrete steps in terms of getting rid of the guardianship of his senior political patron in the person of Vladimir Putin. It is noteworthy that many of those observers who until recently were very skeptical that there were any real, and not ostentatious, contradictions between Dmitry Medvedev and Vladimir Putin, now notice that these tensions, it seems, do exist. Moreover, as the Americans say, the devil is hiding behind the details. In other words, the differences between Medvedev and Putin were clearly visible in the little things that, at first glance, seemed very insignificant. But what does it mean, insignificant little things? Columnist for the Moskovsky Komsomolets newspaper, Alexander Minkin, in his article Eagle or Tales, from the series Letters to the President, published in the weekly Fat Woman MK on June 23, 2010, shared with readers a very important observation, which, again, after all, it was not a secret for the Kremlin VIPs. The Prime Minister of the Russian Federation Vladimir Putin is not present at the meetings of the Cabinet of Ministers when they are held by the President of the Russian Federation Dmitry Medvedev. In the issue of Novaya Gazeta, which was published on June 21, 2010, independent columnist Kirill Rogov published an article with a telling title, Medvedev and Putin, Injections and Undercuts, in which, in particular, he makes a valuable observation. For a long time discussions about the relationship between Medvedev and Putin seemed empty and boring to me. However, the events of recent weeks and days make us take a closer look at what is happening. Here Dmitry Medvedev, in an interview with Americans, remarks dryly about relations with Putin, "I am the president, he is the prime minister, that says it all." And a week before that, Vladimir Putin, suddenly opening up to other foreigners, reports that he says, "you," to Medvedev, while he says, "you," to him. This is already a clear rudeness and violation of decency. Let's allow ourselves a little explanation. Kirill Rogov is referring to Vladimir Putin's interview, which he gave on June 9, 2010 to journalists from the agents France Presse and France 2 TV channel on the eve of his visit to France. In the original, a fragment of this interview about who addresses whom and how, is as follows. Putin is asked the question, "Since we started talking about this, there will be elections in 2012. Now the country has a president, a prime minister. Who now, at this time, makes the final decision? And in Russia, at least the Russians we met say that it looks like you are making the final decision." In Putin's response, it is worth paying attention to his very curious reservations, wording and repeated, over the course of 2 paragraphs, which took the answer to this question, emphasizing his role in government, as well as in fact acknowledging that in the modern political elite of Russia, it seems, in addition to the Putin camp, a Medvedev camp was also formed. So, Putin's answer. You know, there is nothing secret here. The very first phrase of the answer is perceived as an agreement that it is Putin who makes the last decision, about which Vladimir Vladimirovich honestly informs the French author. Everyone is well aware that when my term of office came to an end, I most actively supported the candidacy of Dmitry Medvedev for the post of president of the country. We do not refuse to fulfill our social obligations. Not everyone in France knows that in the context of the crisis we have decided to raise pensions this year by 46%. And from next year, we intend to carry out a large-scale reform in the healthcare sector. This requires a lot of resources. That's when some key things come up. We, of course, need to have an agreed position with President Medvedev. And I, just as before, do not consider it shameful to pick up the phone and tell him, listen, let's agree, let's consult, the very moment in the interview where Putin says that he addresses Medvedev as, you. Author. We are developing a common position, it is becoming even stronger and more stable. After all, there is always a struggle of opinions, a struggle of motives. Someone comes to me, to President Medvedev, a strange, at first glance, phrase. It is natural that the President of the Russian Federation and the Chairman of the government have different official functions, and there is nothing surprising in the fact that someone goes to the head states, and someone, to the Prime Minister. Author. And when we feel that some kind of imbalance is possible, we meet, discuss, make a single agreed decision and carry it out, at a time when the government of the Russian Federation was headed, for example, by Mikhail Fradkov or Viktor Zubkov, there was no imbalance between the cabinet ministers and the president did not even talk. So does he. There are times when he just calls and says, we need to talk. Let's think. This is such a problem, I would like to hear your opinion. That very moment in the interview where Putin makes it clear that Medvedev is addressing him as, you. Author. This is a normal, natural process, which is devoid of narcissism and the desire to show their powers. Or security issues, for example. Our president is the supreme commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and the government must determine the budget of the Ministry of Defense. This phrase can also be understood as follows: a large position is only part of the matter. It is important who controls the distribution of money. Author. Let's continue the quote from the article by Kirill Rogov, the final part of which contains the most important observations and considerations. On the eve of the opening of the St. Petersburg Forum, Putin, contrary to the original scenario, arranges a noisy signing of the agreement between Rosneft and Chevron in his residence, and Putin's ram is Igor II. Appoints a meeting of the board of directors of Rosneft in St. Petersburg exactly at the time when Medvedev is to deliver a keynote speech. All these injections and undercuts, which will seem to the average person more like signs of rivalry between two theatrical primos, are convincing precisely in their insignificance and etiquette pettiness. In fact, the pins and needles of the war of ego are much more difficult to fake and even more difficult to overcome than ideological differences. For deeply hierarchical structures, such as the Russian state apparatus and big business, it is etiquette gestures that are the main signaling system that sends information down the entire carpeted stairs. The agendas put forward by Putin and Medvedev have been completely decided and diverged. Putin appears as a man of action. His credo is the daily manual management of economic entities, layouts, cash flows, and budgets. He constantly demonstrates that all the keys to the real economy on which today's Russia stands are in his hands, and the projects he is involved in are not cranes in the sky, like some. Medvedev's agenda is also well known: modernization and innovations oppose the mundane archaism of Putin's realism with aspiration for the future, designed to demonstrate the insufficiency and exhaustion of Putin's paradigm with its reliance on the old resource-based economy in addition to forceful methods. The problem is not that in Russia now there are, as it were, two bosses. The problem is that the feeling that something needs to be changed is quite ripe in society. You can't blow it away with PR tricks. Moving backwards, Putin looks more and more historically unpromising for society, and this fuels the premier's hostility towards his protégé. At the same time, calls to move forward, Medvedev, look unconvincing for the majority of society so far. As a result, the car skids and starts to overheat from the inside. End of quote. First predictions. What's next? This by no means idle question began to excite an increasing number of politically active citizens at that time. Nikolai Zlobin, director of Russian and Asian programs at the Institute for World Security, USA, Washington, spoke very curiously in this regard on May 6, 2010 on the air of the Echo Moskvy radio station. In particular, Nikolai Vasilyevich stated the following: "Indeed, half of Medvedev's term has passed, and we do not know the answer to the most important question: what did Putin and Medvedev agree on before the 2008 elections? No one knows but them what they agreed on. All other talk about what will happen in 2012 is reminiscent of palmistry. I come to Russia regularly, and every time I get a certain snapshot of public opinion after talking with my friends, with people working at different levels of the Russian hierarchy. It seems to me that Medvedev has 2 years left as president of Russia. Most people in Russia working for the government are convinced that in 2 years he will resign under one pretext or another. But it seems to me that everything is actually not so simple. In order for Medvedev to leave the post of president of the country today, a rather complicated combination is needed for this. And he copes with all the indicators that can be formally presented for assessing the work of the president. It cannot be said that he is a failed president. So why shouldn't he go for a second term? According to the Constitution, he has the right to do so. And any politician in his right mind will never give up his right to steer more, otherwise he is not a politician. He cannot say, "That's it, I warmed up the place for Vladimir Vladimirovich, now I'm leaving." It seems to me that if a successful president, and Medvedev, in my opinion, is a successful president today, does not run for a second term, then it will be necessary to explain why he does not do this. It seems to me that the tandem was created to resolve the specific situation of 2008, for a smooth transition of power while observing the constitution to other hands and while maintaining the Putin system, which he created for 8 years. This task has been solved. Now, by and large, this tandem is no longer needed. Medvedev is Putin's best student, which is largely why he was chosen. But today in the tandem, there is such a situation that the departure of one of the members of this tandem will inevitably greatly weaken the second, whoever this second one may be. There is no President Medvedev without Putin, no matter how it is perceived. In addition, if Dmitry Medvedev does not run for a second presidential term, Vladimir Putin will also have to explain this. Was it a personnel mistake to propose a successor and then remove him after 4 years, as if he had failed? He worked as prime minister under him. He cannot say that, "I supported and approved, and now, in 2012, I must say that I was wrong for 4 years. In fact, Medvedev was a failed president, and I won't come back to correct his mistakes." If both Medvedev and Putin go to the presidential elections, Medvedev will not win the election against Putin. Medvedev has no administrative resources, there is no President Medvedev without Putin. If they split up, Medvedev will be greatly weakened. But on the other hand, Medvedev, first of all, addresses a different category of the Russian population, a demographically different one. To those who are between 25 and 45 years old, relatively speaking, to those who are not yet thinking about retirement, but are thinking about modernization, new technologies, the future of the country, thinking about what to do with children, what to do with the army. Medvedev, in my opinion, tried to become the president for this particular demographic category. Putin will not succeed. Putin is already a grandfather for them. I mean, Putin's generation in world politics, with the possible exception of Berlusconi, is no more. There is already Obama, Sarkozy, these are completely different people. And Putin, returning to this party of world leaders, will look like a grandfather. Like Brezhnev, if he returned to Gorbachev's party. Much has been said and written about the fact that Putin's regime will die or collapse with Putin's departure. This is a type of regime that is based on a particular individual and will go away with the departure of that individual. It seems to me that the problem of 2012 will be partly how to save the regime without Putin, emphasis added. Author. And Medvedev can be such a way out, to keep Putin's strategic choice, modernizing it, so to speak, with everything that Medvedev can modernize, to keep this regime even without Putin. Then Putin, having retired, will become a much more serious political figure, because if a regime outlives its creator, then, of course, the person who created this regime is perceived as a much more serious politician than the politician who created the regime that dies with him. But here, it seems to me, the question already rests on what Putin himself wants and how confident he can be that Medvedev will really continue his strategic line. I spoke with Vladimir Putin and at one time made a simple conclusion, which I think is extremely important. Putin, in principle, has a fairly logical picture of everything that is happening in his head. Therefore, it seems to me that someone who has proposed a completely different picture can be an alternative to Putin. It is pointless to argue with Putin or criticize him on specific issues. We need integrity. Let's interrupt the quote from Nikolai Zlobin's speech in order to confirm his conclusion about the senselessness of disputes with Vladimir Putin. As you know, on May 29, 2010, the 5th annual concert of the Gift of Life Charitable Foundation was held in St. Petersburg, which was attended by children suffering from cancer from all over Russia. Before the concert, the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation Vladimir Putin met with the participants and organizers of this charity evening. Among them were the co-founder of the foundation, theater and film actress Chulpan Komatova, actors and musicians Elisa Freindlich, Leah Akhedzakova, Diana Arbanina, Vyacheslav Butasov, Oleg Basilashvili, Marina Nayalova, Andrei Makarevich, Leonid Yarmolnik and Yuri Shevchuk. As, again, it is known that during this meeting there was a verbal squabble between Putin and Shevchuk. This remarkable dialogue can be read in full on the official website of the chairman of the government of the Russian Federation VV Putin. We offer a fragment of this dialogue, which vividly characterizes the polemical methods used by Vladimir Putin in situations where he is asked uncomfortable questions. VV Vladimir Putin, we can talk about any topic related to our topic today, or we cannot. YU Shevchuk, Vladimir Vladimirovich, can I? VV Putin, yes. YU Shevchuk, it's just that I received a call the day before yesterday, and your assistant, probably some, I don't remember his name, asked me not to ask you sharp questions, political and so on. VV Vladimir Putin, what is your name, excuse me? YU Shevchuk, Yura Shevchuk, musician. VV Vladimir Putin, Yura, this is a provocation. YU Shevchuk, a provocation, okay. VV Vladimir Putin, my assistant could not call you about this. YU Shevchuk, well, not your assistant, some weirdo, yes. I have some questions. In fact, the protest electorate in the country is growing, you know that too. Many dissatisfied with the current situation. Do you have plans for really serious, sincere, honest liberalization, democratization of a real country? So that public organizations are not choked, so that we stop being afraid of a policeman on the street. Because the policeman is now serving the authorities and his own pocket, and not the people. VV Putin frowny face, you say that the police serve only the bosses. There are enough people in the police. There is a cross-section of our society in general. There are people there who faithfully serve their people and do not spare not only their health, they do not spare their lives, and go under bullets. With their cars, the same traffic cops, who remove bribes and haircuts on the road, there are such, but there are also those who cover children with their bodies, substitute cars and die, there are such. Therefore, I consider it unfair to smear everyone with one black tar. YU Shevchuk, I don't smear. VV Vladimir Putin, you don't mean it, but you said that the cops serve the authorities, not the people. YU Shevchuk, basically, yes. I'm going to the March of Dissenters. We are 500 people and 2.5 thousand riot police. Have we killed or stabbed someone? VV Vladimir Putin, I listened to you attentively and did not interrupt. Otherwise, we won't be able to have a discussion, but we'll get a bazaar. If you decide to hold a March of Dissent, I apologize for being too harsh, let's say, at a hospital where you will interfere with sick children, who from the local authorities will allow you to hold this march there. And they will do the right thing by forbidding. YU Shevchuk, may I answer? VV Putin, no. Now let's return to the speech of Nikolai Zlobin on the air of the Echo Moskvy radio station. Arguing on the topic of what to do with Putin's legacy, Zlobin voiced an interesting consideration: in what way did Putin win against the backdrop of Yeltsin? Offered a complete picture. You cannot accept it, you can criticize it, you can consider it terrible, but in Putin's picture, Khodorkovsky, Yukos, money, oil, Chechnya, everything is in its place, everything is folded like a Rubik's cube. And it is impossible to fight this Rubik's cube, you need to bring your own cube. Or, to leave Putin's cube, but giving it into the hands of Medvedev, who will modernize it a little. This, in my opinion, is the problem of 2012, either we leave Putin's cube, or we completely remove this cube, and someone brings something completely new. Medvedev's gingerbread. It is impossible not to agree with the opinion of Nikolai Zlobin about the weakness of the administrative resource, which is at the disposal of the President of the Russian Federation Dmitry Medvedev. Apparently, Dmitry Anatolyevich himself is well aware of this. It seems that Medvedev has also decided whether he will run for a second presidential term. And the closer the date of the official announcement of the presidential election, the stronger the internal tension in the ruling tandem will grow. The fact that the contradictions between Dmitry Medvedev and Vladimir Putin arose a long time ago is indirectly evidenced by many facts. Let's give two more characteristic examples, but not from the category of a protocol exchange of courtesies, which Kirill Rogov talked about. In April-June 2010, several events took place, which were much talked about in Russian and foreign media, but which few people linked together, although such causal comparisons, as they say, suggested themselves. And here was the thing. During his visit to the United States, Dmitry Medvedev, speaking on June 24, 2010 at Stanford University, called the conditions under which he would run for a second presidential term in 2012, if the plans that I have formulated are carried out, if there is support from people, and this is the main thing for any politician, including in order to count on a second term, and if there is a desire to do this, then I do not exclude this for myself. According to the Vedomosti newspaper, this is the most definite statement by D.A. Medvedev about the possibility of nominating his candidacy for a second presidential term after September 2009, when, in fact, talk began about how relations in the Putin-Medvedev tandem would be built in 2012. It is from this point of view that the event that took place in mid-June 2010 can be considered. And although formally the President of the Russian Federation Dmitry Medvedev had nothing to do with this, it is quite obvious that what happened had the most direct aim at the 2012 presidential election. Apparently, Dmitry Medvedev, in choosing his supporters, made a bet, among other things, on the Russian journalistic community. And, for the first time since the dismantling of the Soviet system in 1991, tried not to buy or intimidate journalists, but to turn them into his powerful allies. What do we mean? On June 15, 2010, the plenum of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation adopted Decree No. 16, which is called on the practice of applying the law of the Russian Federation on the mass media by courts. The law of the Russian Federation on the mass media is one of the oldest regulatory legal acts of post-Soviet Russia. It was signed by Russian President Boris Yeltsin back in December 1991 and, perhaps, for the first time during its operation, it received such close attention from the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation. The decree of the plenum of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation of June 15, 2010, signed by the chairman of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation Vyacheslav Lebedev, in fact, summarized the many years of law enforcement practice of this law, giving recommendations to the judicial community of Russia on how to correctly apply the current law right now and how to avoid typical mistakes. Given the fact that the text of the decree was prepared in close cooperation with the Russian journalistic community, there is nothing surprising in the fact that many of its wordings are more than liberal in nature. We refer all those interested in the details to the text of the resolution, which was officially published on June 18, 2010 in Rossiyskaya Gazeta. And of the most fundamental legal novelties recorded in the text of this decree, the following should be noted. The text of the decree of the plenum of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation explained to the judiciary the issue of the so-called interference in personal life. The highest court allows interference in the private life of political figures and exempts journalists from liability if they acted in order to protect the public interest. This means that now the courts will need to distinguish between the reporting of facts, albeit not unambiguous, but capable of having a positive impact on public discussion of issues relating, in particular, to political and public figures in the performance of their duties. The activity of politicians is of public interest, the main court of the country believes. And therefore, the publication, for example, of photographs of a luxurious country house, a yacht or a watch of one or another political figure. Concerning the issue of abuse of freedom of mass media, the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation recommends that the judicial community take into account not only the words and expressions, formulations, allowed in the text, television or radio program, but also take into account, when making a decision, the socio-political situation in the country as a whole or in its particular parts, depending on the region of distribution of this media. That is, again, to take into account the fact of the social significance of the topic being raised, regardless of how offended the person involved in the publication or story is about the form in which he and his activities were presented in the media. A separate paragraph in the decree of the plenum of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation was awarded to such literary genres as humor and satire. The courts need to keep in mind that the humorous and satirical genre, protected by Article 10 of the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, allows a great degree of exaggeration and even provocation, provided that the public is not misled as to the factual side of the matter. The Supreme Court of the Russian Federation also decided whether it is possible to recognize the dissemination of certain information by the mass media in cases where the editor-in-chief of the media and other media workers got acquainted with this information before the publication of the media products. No, such cases do not constitute dissemination of information. And this is a very fundamental point, since there have already been precedents in the law enforcement practice of the law of the Russian Federation on the mass media, when people were sentenced to very specific terms of imprisonment for disseminating information that was recognized by the court as slanderous. Moreover, the information recognized as slanderous was not made public in the media, but the courts equated the acquaintance of a number of employees of the media editorial office with the fact of dissemination of this information among an unlimited circle of people. Finally, in the decree of the plenum of the RF Armed Forces, the issue, which over the past few years has caused ambiguous interpretation, was finally closed. The plenum of the Supreme Court decided that, according to the current legislation of the Russian Federation, sites on the Internet are not subject to mandatory registration as mass media. Which, in turn, means that it is impossible to hold persons distributing mass information through Internet sites liable for the production or distribution of unregistered mass media products. Moreover, the decree of the plenum of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation clearly states that a broadcasting license is not required for a person distributing mass information through a website on the Internet. Also, to sites on the Internet, if they do not have a certificate of state registration as a mass media, and this, as mentioned above, is not mandatory, the rules for the distribution of advertising in television and radio programs established by the federal law on advertising do not apply. The text of the resolution of the Supreme Court was being prepared for several months, and when in April 2010 this work approached the final stage, that is, the draft resolution was already ready, a publication appeared in Rossiyskaya Gazeta. On April 21, 2010, an article was published in the official organ of the government of the Russian Federation Natalia Kozlova, Officer with a Hidden Camera. The plenum of the Supreme Court figured out what the media are responsible for and what they are not responsible for. The response to the liberal initiatives of civilist Dmitry Medvedev was not long in coming, and Putin's whip. We are talking about a well-known bill that expands the rights of the FSB, which at the end of April 2010 the government of the Russian Federation submitted to the deputies of the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation. Der Spiegel, a German magazine, told its readers that Bill number 364,427-5, proposed by the Putin government, gives the Russian security services the ability to detain any suspect for more than 2 weeks without a court order. In fact, this bill allows you to suppress any protest moods in the bud. In the draft law submitted for consideration, FSB officers were given the right to bring to administrative responsibility citizens and organizations that refuse to obey their demands. The special services received this right in addition to one more, to announce to an individual an official warning about the inadmissibility of actions that cause the occurrence of causes and create conditions for the commission of crimes, which this power structure was also instructed to investigate. As stated in the explanatory note to the bill, new powers were needed for the FSB in order to combat terrorism and extremism, since the existing measures are clearly not enough. However, the meaning of the warnings, which should be issued in writing and published in the media, remained completely incomprehensible. Namely, for what reasons specifically can they warn, what exactly can be recognized by these very inadmissible actions? The draft law, however, said this, but in a very streamlined and vague way: actions that cause the occurrence of causes and create conditions for the commission of crimes, the inquiry and preliminary investigation of which is within the jurisdiction of the FSB. But, again, what should be understood by conditions and causes? This was not spelled out in the bill. As a result, a completely new article appeared in the federal law, on the FSB, Article 13.1, the use of special preventive measures by the FSB bodies. These include, in particular, the introduction of a proposal to eliminate the above causes and conditions, as well as the announcement of an official warning about the inadmissibility of actions that cause the occurrence of causes and create conditions for the commission of crimes. At the same time, the FSB agencies were given a wide field for such prevention. Now they can make a submission if there are sufficient data indicating the existence of causes and conditions. Moreover, for the announcement of an official warning, the specified person may be summoned to the FSB. And the text of the warning itself can be published in the media without the permission of the person to whom it was issued. The new version of the law on the FSB states that official warnings and representations are subject to mandatory execution by their addressees. And if they do not, they can be held liable, which is regulated by Art. 19.3 of the Code of Administrative Offenses of the Russian Federation: disobedience to a lawful order of a police officer, a military man, an employee of the authorities for the control of the circulation of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances, an employee of bodies authorized to exercise the functions of control and supervision in the field of migration, or an employee of a body or institution of the penitentiary system. Now this list of officials has been supplemented by an FSB officer. Disobedience to his legal orders or requirements, in connection with the performance of his official duties, as well as obstruction of the performance of his official duties, as defined by the above article of the Code of Administrative Offenses of the Russian Federation, which has been amended accordingly, may result in the imposition of an administrative fine on individuals in the amount of from 500 to 1,000 rubles or administrative arrest for up to 15 days. Officials may be fined in the amount of 1,000 to 3,000 rubles, and legal entities may be fined in the amount of 10,000 to 500,000 rubles. First of all, as mentioned in the already mentioned article of the German magazine Der Spiegel, this applies to the media. The new law will allow the FSB to proactively summon journalists for interrogations and require that articles of undesirable content be removed from websites. It is clear what caused such interest in the Internet. The explanatory note sent to the State Duma of the Russian Federation along with the bill, in particular, said, analysis of the information received by the FSB indicates the intensification of the activities of radical organizations, which leads to an increase in social tension and an increase in negative processes in society, primarily in youth environment. In addition, it was noted that certain media, both print and electronic, openly contribute to the formation of negative processes in the spiritual sphere, the establishment of a cult of individualism and violence, disbelief in the ability of the state to protect its citizens, actually involving young people in extremist activities. On June 11, 2010, deputies of the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation voted for the adoption of this bill in the first reading. Needless to say, only the Duma faction of United Russia voted in favor. Partisan Russia goes on the warpath. The formal grounds for the appearance of this legislative initiative were justified, of course, by the dry figures of official statistics. According to the explanatory note to the bill, the existing measures to combat terrorism and extremism were insufficient. According to the UPC, in 2008 460 extremist crimes were registered in Russia, which is 29% more than in 2007. According to the FSB, in the first 10 months of 2008, 135 extremist crimes were recorded on the territory of the Central Federal District alone, which is almost twice as high as in the same period in 2007. But something else was also clear: excessive tightening the nuts, as you know, may well lead to the fact that the thread will be torn off. The laws of mechanics also apply to human society. Convincing proof of this is an extremely complicated story that seemed to end on June 11, 2010 in the city of Ussurisk, Primorsky Krai, when the last two members of the so-called group of forest partisans were detained. In the final program of Mariana Maximovskaya on the REN TV channel, aired on Saturday, June 12, 2010, a 10-minute story was devoted to these events. A lot was said about the new partisans of the era of Putin's Russia in June 2010, and the internet literally exploded from a mass of comments, conjectures and assumptions. The official version was controversial. As the Far Eastern media reported, according to the investigation department, the forest partisans Andrei Sukharad, Alexander Sladkik, Alexander Kovtun, Vladimir Ilyutikov, Maxim Kurilov and Roman Savchenko are accused of several facts of attacking police officers and illegal trafficking in firearms. The investigation established that the criminal activity of the malefactors began in February 2010, remember this date. Author: when an armed attack on police officers was committed on Davidov Street in Vladivostok. As a result, one policeman was killed, the second was wounded. For several months, the suspects committed theft, hijacking, and arson in the Kirovsky, Dalnarechensky and Spazsky districts of Primorsky Krai. They stole weapons and vehicles from the residents of the districts in order to continue their criminal activities. Why it took the Russian Siloviki several months to neutralize a group of only 6 people, nothing was reported about this. In internet forums, on the contrary, information of a completely opposite kind appeared. For example, at the forum site 2012god.ru in early June 2010, it was reported that, in Primorai, military operations of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation began against some illegal armed group. The actions of this formation began with anonymous appeals to the police to stop lawlessness and corruption. Without waiting for an answer, the members of the formation began operations against the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Now in the Kirovsky district of Primorai, where the detachment is deployed, a large-scale special operation is being carried out. Hundreds of employees of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the FSB are involved. Helicopters are circling over the area. Dozens of sinologists with dogs are involved in the operation against the Muromtsev detachment. So, the 32-year-old officer of the airborne forces Roman Muromtsev was named as the head of the group, on whose behalf the text of a certain appeal to the Russian people, designated as Order No containing a call to protect the Russian people and Russia from national traitors and traitors. In the order, the text of which is easy to find on the internet, it was said that Muromtsev and his associates in the far east of Russia have been waging armed struggle for more than a week, that is, according to the text of this order, since the last days of May, but not since February 2010, that the enemy does not have enough strength to crush their resistance. There was a call to start forming partisan groups to destroy national traitors and traitors to Russia and to take power into their own hands, where possible. An appeal was addressed to all other citizens of the country to support the national liberation struggle for a free Russia and to help in whatever way they could: food, uniforms, money, medicines. The website of the Vladivostok office of Komsomolskaya Pravda reported on June 8, 2010 that, according to unofficial information, since the Department of Internal Affairs still does not give any comments, the gang includes about 30 people, some of them are hiding in the taiga. Policemen are constantly combing the forest. Riot policemen, law enforcement officers from other regions of the region arrived in the Kirovsky district today from Vladivostok. The other day expect 200 security officials from Moscow. In total, according to rough estimates, about 500 people will be involved in the search. In various media during this period, reports began to appear about similar attacks on employees of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in other regions of Russia, in particular, in the Perm territory and the Novgorod region. It was also reported that a curfew was introduced in several areas of the Primorsky territory. Local residents found outside their homes after a certain time were subject to detention, and in case of resistance, to destruction. To search for the rebels, helicopters with thermal imagers were used. One helicopter, they say, was even fired upon by partisans and damaged. It also became known that an order was given: if rebels are found in the forests, they should not be taken prisoner, but destroyed on the spot. In one of the internet forums, a person who introduced himself as an employee of the law enforcement agencies of Primorsky Krai gave details of the search operation, saying that the population, even many representatives of local law enforcement agencies, sympathize with the partisans. He also noted that the local military refused to participate in the destruction of the detachment. He also said that the participants in the search and punitive operation were promised huge monetary rewards. About the leader of the forest partisans, Roman Muromtsev, completely contradictory information was sometimes distributed. So, on June 10, 2010, the website of the public television of Primorai reported, a man who introduced himself as Roman Muromtsev called the newsroom of the public television of Primorai. He stated that he was at home in Vladivostok and was not involved in a criminal group, despite the fact that his name and surname, as well as an identikit, were published in the media indicating that he was a suspect in attacks on law enforcement officers. The audio recording of the telephone conversation is at the disposal of the editors. Detailed information will be published later. There was no continuation. There are at least 3 versions of the causes of the events in Primorsky Krai today. The first is that the coastal, forest partisans, are simply bandits. The second version, actively discussed in the internet community, is that we may have been dealing with an attempt to start a full-scale guerrilla war of the Russian population against those in power. No less curious is the third version, which says that the actions of the forest partisans of Primorai are nothing more than an action planned and carried out by specialists from the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff of the RF Armed Forces. The version about the trace of the GRU in the coastal events is motivated by the fact that this structure, in the conditions of the prosperity of the rest of the Siloviki of Russia, since the beginning of the 2000s, turned out to be the most deprived, if not humiliated. The long-standing love for each other of such structures as the GRU and the FSB is also known. And the fact that GRU officers are able to develop non-standard, breakthrough solutions is also an undoubted fact for knowledgeable people. As an explanation for the possible involvement of the GRU of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation in the planning and implementation of events in the Primorsky territory, some internet commentators recall the strange death of GRU Colonel Anton Surikov, aka Mansour Natkov. According to other sources, Surikov Natkov at the time of his death had special military rank of Major General of the GRU. 48-year-old Surikov Natkov died in Izhevsk on November 23, 2009 as a result of cardiac arrest. It is believed that Surikov was killed by FSB agents shortly before he was to head the GRU. Thus, for the murder of its officer, the GRU took revenge on the FSB in a very unexpected way. However, there is an opinion that Surikov had nothing to do with the Russian special services at all, and his activities were actually aimed at further territorial dismemberment of Russia. Some very knowledgeable internet sources believe that the idea of the Surikov-Natkov fix, it is possible that this is the version launched by the FSB, was to implement the Great Circassia project, which involves the forcible separation from Russia of the regions of the North Caucasus inhabited by Adais, Circassians, as well as adjacent regions, so that in the future Great Circassia would become part of the Pan-Turkic Great Turan. In Runet, you can also find information that the economic basis of the activities of Anton Surikov-Natkov was largely provided by the international consulting agency Far West Limited. Surikov-Natkov in 1999 to 2000 and 2002 to 2007 headed the Russian representative office of this organization. Since 2006, Far West Ltd. has been known as the Information and Consulting Company, private intelligence company Far West, LLC, whose office since January 2006 is located in Dubai, UAE. The company has a political blog in Russian on LiveJournal. Until the summer of 2007, Surikov-Natkov was a shareholder of Far West Ltd., 7.5% of shares, and then he was a member of the board of directors of this company. According to some internet resources, Far West's ideology was not only anti-Russian, but also openly Russophobic in nature. The Far West ideologists and socio-political organizations cooperating with them declare, in particular, that the oppressed peoples can gain real freedom and independence only as a result of the liquidation of the Russian Federation, formed in 1991 as another incarnation of the evil empire, which is a historical continuation of the Golden Horde, the Moscow Principality, the Russian Empire and the Stalin-Brezhnev Soviet Union. In reality, Far West is controlled by the highest British and American power elites. According to various sources, Far West controls the supply of 70% of Afghan heroin to Europe and 80 to 90% of Colombian cocaine to Russia. These internet sources also claim that such Russian public and political figures as Garry Kasparov, Mikhail Delyagin, Alexander Prokhanov, Gaidar Dzemil, Mikhail Kazyanov, Sergei Glaziev, Ilya Ponomarev, Anatoly Baranov, Vladimir Mylov, Sergei Kurginyan worked for Surikov Nakov, Yulia Latinina, Andrei Pyankovsky, Alexei Podberezkin, Oleg Shine, Marina Litvinovich, Ivan Starikov and a number of others. The activities of the Major General of the GRU, Surikov Nakov, of course, deserve a separate study, but in our case, its aspect related to the dismantling of the current political system in Russia is of interest. From the information contained on the internet resources mentioned above, we can conclude that Anton Surikov-Nakov was most directly involved in the promotion of Dymovsky in order to strike at the leadership of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, with the ultimate task of knocking out Putin's key henchman from the chair of the Minister of Internal Affairs, R. Nergalieva. The Siloviki, surrounded by Medvedev, have finally begun an active game for their piece of the shrinking pie with Putin's. In September 2009, Surikov said, "If this happens, the removal of Putin and the release of Khodorkovsky, Perestroika, too will begin, and the non-Russian peoples of the Russian Federation will have to prepare for independence. If it doesn't happen, rotting in the format of a primitive raw material economy will continue for another 10 to 15 years, and the peoples of the Russian Federation and the former USSR will have to prepare for war. There is no third." Some analysts directly link the murder of Surikov-Nakov and the events in Primorsky Krai. Surikov was poisoned last fall. And then many observers blamed the FSB or the Ministry of Internal Affairs for this. It is unlikely that the GRU, as a corporation, forgave this murder of its authoritative general. And here is the accidental coincidence. Something mysteriously explodes under Putin's car. And in the Far East, a well-organized guerrilla war begins. And, finally, the final court of events in Primorsky Krai. On Tuesday, June 29, 2010, large-scale military exercises, Vostok, 2010, began in the Far Eastern Military District, which were held until July 8, 2010. According to news agencies, during the various stages of the Vostok 2010 exercises, various unrelated tactical episodes with live firing and the movement of troops over long distances will be worked out at the Far Eastern training grounds in order to localize, eliminate, internal armed conflicts in an unfamiliar and hard-to-reach areas. It is planned to involve up to 20,000 military personnel, up to 70 aircraft, up to 2,500 pieces of weapons, military and special equipment, up to 30 ships. Formations and military units of the Eastern Regional Command of the Internal Troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia are involved in the operational strategic exercises. The press service of the Internal Troops, VV, of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation reports. The personnel of the Internal Troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia, against the background of the exercises, will take part in working out the issues of eliminating the consequences of man-made disasters and emergencies. Particular attention will be paid to solving problems of joint actions in the course of countering illegal armed formations and large armed gangs.